In case you ever doubted your power.
Select investigative panel will come to order, and the chair recognizes herself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I want to welcome all of our witnesses who are here today, and I'm going to introduce each of our witnesses in a moment. And I look forward to hearing the testimony from each of you on bioethics and fetal tissue. The last decade has produced tremendous change in medical research and therapies. We are in the middle of a biotechnology revolution. Certainly, in my home state of Tennessee, this is evident, and even today, we have members of Bio-Tennessee who are on the Hill. Each week, an announcement from this industry presents a new therapy or a new tool or a new possibility in the search for life-saving cures for diseases and afflictions that cause untold pain and suffering. New words have entered our vocabulary: 3-parent children, chimeras, CRISPR gene editing, and bioinformatics. Words like organ transplant or tissue rejuvenation seem like ancient history in favor of regenerative medicine, which might eventually reconstitute entire organs from adult stem cells. In a word, things really are moving quite quickly. Like all revolutions, ethical questions and moral challenges can lag behind. But the new information and knowledge in medical science raises important questions. What does it mean? What are the historic principles of do no harm? Promoting disinterested decisions by medical professionals, and very importantly, addressing the question of human dignity and personhood. Ours is not the first era to face such questions. The Nuremberg Code produced a human rights-based ethics statement after horrible information was revealed about experimenting on humans without permission. We learned years after it was underway about prisoners in China forced to donate organs or killed for their organs. We learned about the horrors of forced abortion and testing drugs on the poor and unaware after it had happened. We all remember the horrible reports about the syphilis studies on African Americans or forced sterilization of the mentally challenged years or even decades after it happened. Last summer's videos revealed that something very troubling is going on related to fetal tissue and research. The weak, vulnerable, those with no voice, harvested and sold, there is something going on and something that deserves investigating, and it demands our best moral and ethical thinking. This first hearing on ethics focuses our attention on procuring and transferring baby body parts and related matters. We will hear from professors who teach ethics, from medical practitioners, from those who do biomedical research, from those within America's faith traditions, so that we as legislators might become informed about the ethical implications and issues for the woman who terminates a pregnancy, for the researcher, for the person who needs a cure, and for the baby. This is then about bioethics. We did not invite our guest here to debate election year politics or journalism ethics, or whether this select panel should be funded. I ask my colleagues to join me in focusing on bioethics so that we might hear the best testimony our witnesses have to offer. I welcome each and every one of you, and I look forward to hearing from you. At this time, I yield 5 minutes to the ranking member, Ms. Schakowsky of Illinois.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to make two key points. First, fetal tissue research has saved millions of lives and has the potential for saving millions more. And that's why many Republicans have long supported and should continue to support the use of fetal tissue for research purposes. Second, today's hearing is not part of a serious investigation into fetal tissue research or anything else. 12 states, 3 congressional committees, and a grand jury in Texas have already investigated and found no evidence that Planned Parenthood is seeking to profit from the sale of fetal tissue. Indeed, the only criminal acts uncovered in the course of these investigations have been those of anti-abortion extremist David Daleiden, who is now under indictment in Texas for his role in manufacturing the deceptively edited videos that have fueled the Republicans' latest attacks on women and their doctors. Faced with these facts, the select panel should have disbanded. Instead, the chair has embarked on a partisan and dangerous witch hunt. Her actions are putting the privacy and safety of Americans at risk. Over the repeated objection of the Democratic members of the panel, the chair has sent dozens of document requests to academic institutions, medical schools, and healthcare providers across the country. She has already issued 3 unilateral subpoenas demanding the names of individual researchers, graduate students, medical students, doctors, and clinic personnel, and is threatening to issue more. There are no rules in place to protect these names from public disclosure. In fact, the chair's staff has made it perfectly clear that any name turned over to the panel may be released to the public. There is no reason to create such a database, and the chair's abuse of her position as chair to compel this information is frankly reminiscent of Senator Joe McCarthy's abusive tactics. We live in a world where researchers who use fetal tissue are compared to Nazi war criminals, and extremists have tried to burn clinics to the ground. We live in a world where women have to face a gauntlet of harassment to get health care, and where there are threatening websites that identify reproductive health care providers, their families, and maps of the location to their clinics and homes. On the day after Thanksgiving, a gunman drove 60 miles to a Planned Parenthood clinic in Colorado Springs, killed 3 people, injured 9 others, and terrorized doctors and patients. And when arrested, he uttered the words, quote, "No more baby parts," unquote, a phrase that many of my Republican colleagues have invoked both before and after these murders and in connection with this panel's investigation. Linking individual names to an investigation that the Republicans describe as examining, quote, the harvesting, unquote, of, quote, baby body parts, and, unquote, and the, quote, horrific, unquote, practice of abortion providers puts people in danger. Our words and our actions matter. The chair has refused to explain why she needs a database of names. As the Washington Post editorial board asked just a few weeks ago, quote, how is the name of a graduate student who 5 years ago was an intern at a lab relevant to anything, unquote. There is no apparent reason for this other than harassment and intimidation. Republicans may not like the fact that abortion is legal and therefore safe for women in this country, but that is no excuse for putting students, researchers, women, and their doctors at risk. The Democratic members of this committee have repeatedly asked the chair to stop demanding that information. We have proposed reasonable rules that would prevent collection of certain information and otherwise protect the information that we do receive. So far, the chair has ignored our requests. Nonetheless, I want to make this very clear to the entities that are under threat of subpoena or contempt from the chair, and to every researcher, doctor, and woman in America. Democrats will continue to fight to keep them safe. The unfortunate truth is that this partisan pursuit of the manufactured false allegations of anti-abortion extremists is putting Americans in harm's way, and it must stop. It is time to turn our attention to ensuring not attacking critical medical research and women's access to health care. With that, I request unanimous consent to enter into the record the February 21st, 2015 Washington Post editorial, quote, "The Planned Parenthood Witch Hunt," and I yield back the balance of my time.
And your entry is made without objection. The gentlelady
Madam Chairperson.
yields back her
Madam
time.
Madam Chairperson.
Gentleman is recognized.
I have a parliamentary inquiry, Madam Chair.
Parliamentary inquiry. State your inquiry.
Madam Chair, my colleague, the ranking member, noted in her opening remarks our concerns about your dangerous and sweeping demands for the names of individual researchers, graduate medical students, doctors, and clinic personnel. Can you explain what rules govern these demands?
The answer to your inquiry, we are entitled to the information, and we're going to take
Under
the
what
necessary.
rules are you entitled to the information is my question.
We are under the jurisdiction of the rules of the House of Representatives and the rules of the Committee on Energy and Commerce.
Very well. Further parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman will state his inquiry.
If we are under the rules of the Committee on Energy and Commerce, Rule 16 of the Rules of the Energy and Commerce Committee requires that, quote, the chair shall notify the ranking minority member prior to issuing any subpoena under such authority. To the extent practicable, the chair shall consult with the ranking minority member at least 72 hours in advance of a subpoena being issued under such authority. The chairman shall report to the members of the committee on the issuance of a subpoena as soon as practicable, but in no event later than 1 week after issuance of such subpoena. Unquote. Those rules require three things, Madam Chair. They require you to notify the ranking member in advance. They require you to consult with the ranking member and to do so 72 hours before issuing a subpoena. And they require you to report within a week to the committee. On Friday, February 12th, you told Ranking Member Schakowsky during votes on the House floor that you would be issuing subpoenas the next week. We immediately asked for a meeting to discuss this and for a copy of the subpoena so that we could see what you were requesting. Those requests were refused. You then issued the subpoenas on the 16th of February, 4 days after that conversation, and have yet to report on their issuance. Madam Chair, can you explain what constitutes consultation and reporting within the meaning of Energy and Commerce Rule 16?
Energy and Commerce Committee requires a conversation on the committee's plans, which I did. And I will remind the gentleman the resolution establishing this panel, House Resolution 461, stated that Rule 11 of the House of Representatives and the rules of the committee apply to this panel. Further, the rules of the Committee on Energy and Commerce do not require its subcommittees and this panel. The functional equivalent of a subcommittee are not required to first meet or organize before conducting business.
Madam Chair, further parliamentary inquiry. Whether
Your inquiry.
what you have described is a longstanding practice, the fact is we made a direct, or the ranking member made a direct request to discuss these particular subpoenas and have a copy of them. The flat refusal even to communicate with Democratic members has unfortunately been commonplace since the outset of this investigation and violates the duty under the rule to consult. With regard to reporting, we have yet to receive any report on the issuance of these subcommittees, including, and this is critically important, exactly what information entities are refusing to produce and how that information is pertinent to this investigation. Contrary to your public claims that these entities had not cooperated with the panel, they have in fact done so. They have turned over hundreds of documents, and to the extent there remains any disagreement, it appears to be over your demand that they turn over the names of students, researchers, doctors, and clinic personnel. To date, you have refused to explain how this information is pertinent to the investigation. The recipients of your demands are entitled to this information, as are your Democratic and Republican colleagues. It is incumbent on you, certainly prior to moving to issue or enforce a subpoena, to show how the information you demand is pertinent to the matters we are investigating. Madam Chair, will you explain how the names of individual medical or graduate students, researchers, healthcare providers, and clinic personnel are pertinent to this investigation, please?
No, sir, I am not going to do that, but I will let you know, Mr. Nadler, that copies of all the document requests have been made available to the minority. Copies of the subpoenas have been made available, and the requirements have been met. And at this point, we're going to move
Madam
on
Chair,
and introduce
I have one further parliamentary inquiry, which I would
State your inquiry.
I will state at the outset, I disagree with the assertion that we need to compile a database of names to get answers that we can easily get from institutional representatives, persons who are akin to 30B6 witnesses under the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. You have refused to inform the subcommittee, to consult with the subcommittee. You should drop the demand for names and adopt the rules that we have proposed, which will ensure a more balanced and fair investigation. If not, we should at least, if you will not change the rules, we should at least obey our current rules. We cannot proceed in flagrant violation of the rules, nor should we proceed with dangerous subpoenas that endanger the lives and physical safety of patients, providers, and researchers in a way that could make this committee complicit with any physical assaults on these people or any murders of these people. I therefore move to quash the subpoenas.
Move to table. Somebody move to table.
Madam Chair,
There's a motion
The
and a second.
gentleman, the gentleman is recognized.
I move to quash the request. Motion.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania moves to table the motion.
Okay.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania has moved to table the motion. The question occurs on approving the motion to table. All those in favor of signifying to table the motion will say aye. Aye. All opposed say no.
No.
The ayes have it.
Roll call
Roll
vote.
call
Ayes
vote
have it. Roll
requested.
call is requested.
Mr. Pitts?
Aye.
Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Black? Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Bouchon? Mr. Bouchon, aye. Mr. Duffy? Mr. Duffy, aye. Mr. Harris? Mr. Harris, aye. Ms. Hartzler?
Aye.
Ms. Hartzler, aye. Ms. Love?
Aye.
Ms. Love, aye. Ms. Zukowski?
No.
Ms. Zukowski, no. Mr. Nadler?
No.
Mr. Nadler, no. Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette, no. Ms. Spire? Ms. Spear? No. Ms. Delbene? Ms. Delbene, no. Ms. Watsman-Coleman? No. Ms. Watsman-Coleman, no. Ms. Blackburn?
Aye.
Ms. Blackburn, aye.
Clerk will report.
Ms. Chairman, on that vote, there were 8 ayes and 6 nays.
The motion is tabled. At this time, we will introduce our first panel. I will ask that our panelists please move to the table as they are called forward. First, Ms. Paige Comstock Cunningham. She is the Executive Director of the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity. She is a fellow at the Institute for Biotechnology and the Human Future and a trustee of Taylor University. Dr. Gerald Donovan. Dr. Gerald Kevin Donovan is Senior Clinical Scholar at the Kennedy Institute of Ethics at Georgetown University. He is also Director of the Pellegrino Center for Clinical Bioethics and Professor of Pediatrics at Georgetown. Professor Alta Charo. Professor Charo is the Warren P. Knowles Professor of Law and Bioethics at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, where she is on the faculty of the law school and the Department of Medical History and Bioethics at the medical school. I want to welcome each of you, and at this point, I would like to make certain that as you are here, you are aware that the Selective Investigative Panel is holding an investigative hearing and will take testimony under oath. Do you have an objection to testifying under oath? The chair then advises you that under the rules of the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, you are entitled to be advised by counsel. Do you desire to be advised by counsel during your testimony today? Thank you. If each of you will stand to be sworn in for your testimony. Do each of you swear that the testimony that you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. You are now under oath and subject to the penalty set forth in Title 18, Section 1001 of the U.S. Code. You may have 8 minutes to make a written summary, to provide a statement summary of your written testimony, and we thank each of you for providing that. I'm going to ask that you make sure that your mic is on before you give your testimony, and then that you will turn the mic off when you finish, and you will turn it back on when we move to the question portion. And Dr. Donovan, we will begin with you for your testimony.
Well, thank you, Chairman Blackburn and members of the panel. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to present testimony regarding the bioethical considerations in the harvesting, transfer, and use of fetal tissue and organs. I'm a physician, trained in both pediatrics and clinical bioethics. I've spent my entire professional career caring for infants and children. It was this interest and concern that led me to further study in bioethics, because I've always been concerned about the most vulnerable patients, those who need others to speak up for them, both at the beginning and at the end of life. I also have significant familiarity with research ethics, having spent 17 years as the chair of an IRB, although I am myself not a research scientist. The IRB, as you know, is the board that monitors the rightness and wrongness of medical research in order to protect human subjects. We took this aspect of our duty so seriously that I renamed our IRB the Institutional Research Ethics Board. 4 years ago, I was called by my mentor, Dr. Edmund Pellegrino, to take his place as director of the Center for Clinical Bioethics at Georgetown University. Our duties include ethics education for medical students and resident physicians, ethics consultation for patients and doctors at the hospital, as well as the promulgation of scholarly papers and public speaking. We focus on both clinical ethics, that which directly involves the good of patients, as well as addressing normative questions, those which involve right and wrong. This is what we want young physicians to know. Medicine is a moral enterprise. Our actions have consequences that can be good or bad for patients, and we must always focus on the patient's good and avoid doing harm. So what does this mean for the topic at hand? We're talking about bioethics in the fetus. In order to make any moral judgments, we would have to be clear on the moral status of the fetus. Obviously, this is an area in which society has not reached a consensus, but that does not mean we cannot make sound judgments on the topic. In a question of biomedical ethics, it's good to start with solid science. What do we know about the fetus with certainty? Well, first of all, we know that it's alive, that it represents growing, developing cells, tissues, and organs, all of which develop increasing complexity and biologic sophistication, resulting in an intact organism, a human baby. Of course, this growth and development does not cease with the production of the baby, but continues for many years afterwards. As can be seen by this description, the fetus is not only alive, but is demonstrably human. I'm not talking about a potential human, in the way that some parents talk about their teenagers as potential adults. I'm referring to the scientific fact that a fetus constitutes a live human, typically 46XX or 46XY, fully and genetically human. In fact, it is the irrefutable humanness of these tissues and organs that have made them be of interest to researchers and scientists. So, if a fetus is clearly both alive and human, can we justify taking these tissues and organs for scientific experimentation? If so, under what circumstances and what sort of consent or authorization should be required? In the past century, medicine has made incredible progress, resulting from scientific studies involving human tissues and organs, resulting in the development of medications, vaccines, and the entire field of transplantation medicine. Is there any difference between these accomplishments and those that would require the harvesting of body parts and tissues from the fetus? First, we'd have to admit that not all scientific experimentation has been praiseworthy. Studies done by Dr. Mengele in Germany and by American researchers in Guatemala and Tuskegee were morally abhorrent. And any knowledge gleaned from these would be severely tainted. No one would want to associate our current scientific studies involving the human fetus with such egregious breaches of research ethics. All that it takes to avoid such a comparison is a consensus on the moral status of the fetus. Those who have proceeded with experimentation and research on embryonic and fetal cells, tissues, and organs typically have obtained them as the result of an abortion. It is this stark fact that makes such scientific endeavors controversial, because they have proceeded without the aforementioned consensus on the moral status of the fetus. Because we know that the fetus is alive and human, we must find some explanation for why it should not be treated with the same dignity that we accord all other human lives. The most frequent argument offered is that, although it is a human life, it is not a human person. Various criteria are offered for a definition of personhood, but none have been found universally acceptable. We thus have a standoff between those who would protect this early, vulnerable human life and those that would deny that it deserves protection. In order to resolve such an ethical dilemma, the guiding principle is this: one is morally permitted to take such a life once you can demonstrate with moral certainty that the life is not fully human. It is a concept that can be exemplified by the situation faced by a hunter when he sees a bush shaking. He may sincerely believe that it's a deer in the bush, but if he kills it prior to determining with certainty what it is that he is killing, he will be morally responsible, as well as legally, if he has in fact killed the farmer's cow, or worse yet, the farmer. As we can see, two deeply held but opposing viewpoints need not be resolved unless someone intends to act upon them. Then the one who intends to take the action resulting in the death of the disputed entity must not do so unless they can first show with moral certainty that their perception of its moral worth is irrefutable. Those who would not disturb the normal progression of its life bear no such burden. It's my contention that such proof does not exist, and deliberate fetal destruction for scientific purposes should not proceed until it does. Moreover, without disputing the arguable necessity of research on fetal tissues, an arguable necessity, I would also point out that harvesting it in such a way is unnecessary. Not only do cell lines already exist that were produced in such a fashion, but new cell lines could be obtained from fetal tissues harvested from spontaneous miscarriages. This is not a theoretical alternative. Georgetown University has a professor who has patented a method of isolating, processing, and cryopreserving fetal cells from second semester, meaning 16 to 20-week gestation, miscarriages. These have already been obtained and are stored in Georgetown freezers. Moreover, the present practices of obtaining fetal tissues and organs would seem to go against the procedures that have been approved for others who harvest tissues and organs donated for transplantation. First, we follow a strict rule, the dead donor rule. It states that vital, unpaired organs cannot be obtained unless the donor has died a natural death. This obviously is not the case in an induced abortion. Moreover, such tissues or organs cannot be harvested without the consent of the patient or their proper surrogate. In pediatrics, parents are considered the normal, proper surrogate. However, this interpretation rests on the presumption that the parent is acting in the best interest of the individual child. It is difficult to sustain such an interpretation when it's the same parent who has just consented to the abortive destruction of that individual fetus from whom those tissues and organs would be obtained. Finally, we are at a difficult time in our nation's history. We demonstrate much moral ambiguity in our approach to the human fetus. We have decided that we can legally abort the same fetus that might otherwise be a candidate for fetal surgery, even using the same indications as justification for acts that are diametrically opposed. We call it the fetus if it's to be aborted and its tissues and organs transferred to a scientific lab. We call it a baby, even at the same stage of gestation, when someone plans to keep it and bring it into their home. Language has consequences, but it can also reflect our conflicts. We are a nation justly proud of the progress and achievements of our biomedical research, but life-saving research cannot and should not require the destruction of life for it to go forward. If we cannot act with moral certainty regarding the appropriate respect and dignity of the fetus, we cannot morally justify its destruction. Alternatives clearly exist that are less controversial, and moral arguments exist that support our natural abhorrence at the trafficking of human fetal parts. Surely we can, and surely we must, find a better way. Thank you.
Ms. Cunningham, you are recognized.
Madam Chair Blackburn, Ranking Member Schakowsky, and members of the Select Investigative Panel, thank you for the opportunity to speak about the ethics surrounding the use of fetal tissue for research. My argument, which is expanded in my written testimony, is threefold. First, respect the fetus. The fetus is a human being who is entitled to the protections of modern guidelines for medical research. The foundational principles of respect for persons should apply to unborn children without distinction. Second, you cannot take a life and then give away the body. Participants in elective abortion, including the mother, are morally disqualified from consenting to donating the body, organs, or tissue of the now dead fetus for research purposes. And third, there are better, more ethical options. First, at the core of our concern is the fundamentally important question: who or what is the fetus? The biological facts are clear. The fetus is an organism in charge of her own integral organic functioning, enduring and developing over time through all the stages of human existence: first embryo, fetus, infant, adolescent, and adult. Rather than being a distinct and lesser form of human life, the fetus is a distinct human being at a particular stage of development. She is not a potential human being, but an actual human being. No one has the right to take her life by force. Those who are responsible for her death have failed to recognize the fundamental principle of human dignity. They have no moral claim to donate or assign her body, organs, or tissues to others. Even more, others should not profit from this wrongful act, whether for monetary gain, scientific reputation, better health, or even to claim these cures are so wonderful, how could anyone oppose this research? The regulatory scheme of protection for human subjects of medical research has continued to expand protection for research subjects to ensure that their participation is voluntary and fully informed, and that the research is for their benefit, or if not, causes no more than minimal harm, and that they may have access to the benefits of the research. Protections have been explicitly extended to most vulnerable populations, but not to the fetus to be aborted. If she were being treated in utero for her own benefit, the HHS policy for protection of human subjects provides heightened protection for her well-being. That same HHS policy also provides special protections for prisoners, but not for the fetus to be aborted. Some have argued that we all share a moral obligation to contribute our organs or bodies after death for the good of society. Others claim the principle of proximity, the view that we would want to help those most like us. In her analysis of fetal tissue transplantation, Kathleen Nolan elaborates on a problem with this view, and I quote, "In the setting of elective abortion, a cruel irony thus emerges. Fetuses that have been excluded from membership in the human community by a societally sanctioned maternal decision to abort now have obligations to that same community because of membership in it," end quote. We reject this cruel irony. Now, federal law does attempt to erect a barrier of sorts between the decision to abort and the decision to donate. For example, the procedure must not be altered in any way to accommodate researchers' needs. And elements of informed consent for tissue donations should include telling the donor's family if the tissue will be used outside the U.S., whether it will be modified into a commercial product, the distinction between the for-profit and nonprofit entities involved, and that she be given a copy of the form she signed. Is the woman contemplating donation made aware of the specific body parts that will be harvested? The request may be for the unborn child's eyes, his brain, his kidneys that might be transplanted into a rat, his thymus or pancreas, but the greatest demand might be for his liver. Women might find this factual information relevant to their decision. So how is effective informed consent accomplished in a setting where there is no established institutional oversight to ensure compliance with this regulation, as the vast majority of abortions take place in clinics that are outside the ordinary system of healthcare and the accreditation requirements that exist in hospitals and ambulatory surgical centers? Further, abortion clinic owners vigorously resist health standards that are imposed on all other ambulatory surgical centers. The history of the use of human bodies and parts in medical education and research reveals a disturbing pattern of first seeking access from the most disadvantaged in society. One national commission noted that there have been, quote, instances of abuse in the area of fetal research, and that the poor and minority groups may bear an inequitable burden as research subjects, close quote. It would be enlightening to know whether that abuse continues, and the demographic profiles of women who are solicited to donate. There is yet another reason to oppose the current practices of fetal tissue research. It is unnecessary. Alternative, ethically derived sources of its cells exist, and they are working. My written testimony addresses this more fully, and I will defer to other witnesses to speak to this more directly. A just society has no moral or other claim on electively aborted fetal bodies, organs, or tissues. Unborn children scheduled for termination by induced abortion are among, if not the most vulnerable members of the human family. As has been said by many leaders in many ways, a society will be judged by how we treat our weakest, most vulnerable members. Curbing the current practices of fetal tissue research would be a small but very significant step toward honoring the dignity of all our members. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cunningham. Professor Charo, you are recognized for 8 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, Ranking Member Schakowsky, and members of the Select Investigative Panel. Thank you for allowing me to address you today on the question of fetal tissue research. My name's Charo. I'm a member of the National Academy of Medicine and was a member of the National Bioethics Advisory Commission from 1996 to 2001. At present, I'm the Warren P. Knowles Professor of Law and Bioethics on the faculties of both the Law School and the School of Medicine and Public Health at the University of Wisconsin. But I'd like to note for the record that I am not here to represent the University of Wisconsin or any of its units, and that I have used my own personal funds in order to attend the hearing. Madam Chairman, fetal tissue has been used in research in this country since the 1920s, and NIH has funded it since the 1950s. It has been deemed ethical by federal review bodies going back half a century, and has been specifically authorized by Congress for funding for over a quarter century, precisely because it has saved the lives of countless people, including children and infants. It continues to be ethical, and it will continue to save lives. In my view, supporting this research represents a commitment to helping today's patients and tomorrow's infants. I say this for 3 reasons. First, this research serves a compelling public health purpose. Second, it operates within a framework of state and federal law. And third, support for it need not depend on one's views about abortion. First, any discussion about fetal tissue must begin with its unimpeachable claim to have saved the lives and improved the health of millions of people. Indeed, almost every American has benefited from this research in the form of vaccines for whooping cough, tetanus, chicken pox, and German measles. Diseases do not discriminate, and the beneficiaries of this research come from every place on the political, religious, geographic, and economic spectrum. You yourselves and those whom you love are undoubtedly among those who have benefited from this research and whose lives have been made better. When work began nearly a century ago, no one knew precisely where the research would lead, but over time it led to a Nobel Prize for developing a polio vaccine using cell lines from fetal tissue. Today, scientists also cannot say precisely which disease will benefit or when, but HHS says that fetal tissue continues to be a critical resource for developing vaccines against dengue fever, HIV, and Ebola, and for research on such devastating diseases as Huntington's, chorea, and Alzheimer's. And as of this year, Zika virus is also on that growing list. I would note for your attention that the CDC has posted information on its website on how to provide fetal tissue, including neurological tissue, preferably with the architectural structure intact, specifically for the purpose of studying and managing the Zika virus to prevent devastating birth defects in tomorrow's infants. Now, some people may find the dispassionate technical language used by professionals to be startling, but one should never mistake that for callousness, particularly when talking about men and women who have devoted their lives to improving all of our lives through medicine and science. And the use of cadaveric tissue and organs ranging from mature hearts from adults to fetal tissue can make some people uncomfortable about benefiting from material whose origins lie in complex situations. But it does not prevent us from accepting this life-saving gift. Critics have overwhelmingly partaken of the vaccines and treatments derived from fetal tissue and give no indication they will forswear further benefits. Fairness and reciprocity alone would suggest they should support the work or at least not thwart it. Second, the use of fetal tissue in research has been specifically protected under American law for over 50 years, beginning in the 1960s with the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act, which was drafted specifically to include a provision allowing fetal tissue to be donated just as other cadaveric tissue is donated. And in 1974, President Ford had a commission look specifically at fetal tissue research, and that commission also found that it is ethical. In the 1980s, President Reagan created the Human Fetal Tissue Transplantation Research Panel, chaired by the late Arlen Adams, a Republican, a retired federal judge, an opponent of abortion rights, and the author of a book entitled A Nation Dedicated to Religious Liberty. Like the earlier Ford Commission, the Reagan panel found the research to be ethical, declared there was no evidence that fetuses were ever killed for the purpose of obtaining tissue, and no evidence that it ever had any effect on decision-making or on the number of abortions performed in this country. However, to guard against even that hypothetical possibility, current practice follows those recommendations, and discussion about donation takes place only after a woman has definitively decided to terminate her pregnancy. Indeed, the Reagan panel explicitly considered the question of whether the woman herself should be the one who gives consent, and concluded that she was the party most interested in this topic and in this outcome, and therefore she retained the moral authority to make this decision. They viewed any alternative to be even more problematic. Fetal tissue research is subject to local oversight committees, state law, laboratory tissue bank regulations, and various federal laws, addressing everything from the consent process to collection and storage to confidentiality of records. 2 separate GAO investigations have found no violations and found no sale of tissue, but only legally permitted reimbursement of expenses, and no violations have been found in any current investigations at either the federal or state level. Third, support for fetal tissue transcends the debate about abortion rights. Federal review has repeatedly found that the option to donate tissue has no effect on whether a woman will choose to have an abortion. That is one reason why the Congress passed by overwhelming bipartisan legislation, bipartisan margins that codified the recommendations of the Ford and Reagan committees' authorization to fund this research in particular. Some of the most passionate supporters of that research recognize the difference between opposition to abortion rights and opposition to research using fetal tissue. Senator John McCain, for example, was quoted as saying, "My abhorrence for the practice of abortion is unquestionable, yet my abhorrence for these diseases and the suffering they cause is just as strong." In this country, women have a constitutionally protected right to safe and legal abortion services. They make those decisions for their own reasons. And after that, some of them choose to donate the cadaveric fetal tissue to research. We gain nothing when we turn our back on the benefits of that research for people who are sick today or will be sick tomorrow, to say nothing of the irony of halting research that improves our chance of preventing miscarriages, preventing birth defects, and saving infant lives. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Charo. And I will note that both of our female panelists came in with time to spare. And I think that is off to a great start. I yield myself 5 minutes for questions as we begin our question round. And again, I thank you all. I'm kind of going to do a lightning round on questions, if you will. So we will begin, Dr. Donovan, with you in responses, and then just go right down the line. So first question, do you think any business or clinic should sell fetal tissue for a profit?
No.
Ms.
I do not.
Keep your mics on, please.
I do not.
Okay.
It's against the law.
Thank you all. Number two, do you think that fetal organs should be grown and harvested for transplant?
No.
If they can be grown ethically, but not from the fetus itself.
Okay.
I apologize, but I'm not sure I understand exactly what you mean by grown. Are you talking about getting pregnant deliberately in order to donate tissue? No, I would not think that that is appropriate. And in fact, the Reagan panel specifically worried about so-called directed donation and recommended that that be forbidden, and it is under the law. If you're talking about the creation of synthetic organs, which is currently under investigation, and is something I believe my colleague Dr. Goldstein might even be talking about in the next panel, then I think that is something that needs a closer look. And without further information, I couldn't say, but it's probably a very good alternative.
Okay, thank you. Question number three. Do you think fetal tissue should be used for cosmetics, cell lines to do taste tests for food, or for experiments that combine human and animal DNA?
No matter how they're obtained, I would find these distasteful. No.
I agree with Dr. Donovan.
Okay.
I think fetal tissue should be used in the same ways we use tissue from adults who have died, and that includes a wide range of uses. Some of the ones you mentioned are certainly not the ones that are the most compelling, but they are within the law at this time.
Okay. Number four, if an alternative source of tissue to form cell lines exists, such as spontaneous miscarriages, do you think that is a more ethical approach?
It does exist, and it is more ethical.
Yes, and panels have found that to be the case.
It can be used, but it was found to be insufficient as a substitute for tissue from fetuses that were electively aborted. That was specifically considered by the Reagan panel and has been the subject of investigation since then due to the kinds of causes that underlie miscarriages and often change the nature of the tissue. But certainly it would be less controversial if one could find tissue that does not raise questions about the abortion debate, and avoiding controversy is preferable when it is possible, but not simply in order to avoid controversy at the expense of public health.
Thank you. And the fifth question, if vaccines exist that do not rely upon fetal tissue or cell lines, should consumers be given a choice?
Actually, for the most part, those vaccines do exist. There are a few still left over from the cell line started in the 60s, to which there is no alternative. Many people have asked that an alternative be developed. That wasn't a yes or a no, was it?
But it's an answer, and that is perfectly fine.
Thank you.
I appreciate that, and I will take that elaboration.
I think parents and patients should be aware of the source of the vaccines they're using, or at least it should be available for their information for them to make their own choice about whether to use one that's derived ethically or unethically.
That information is available on the internet. I have no problem with the idea of saying that people have the right to have as much information as possible and to make choices for themselves. I would note in passing that with regard to the vaccines that have no current alternatives, the Vatican has said specifically that although they would wish that there be other alternatives available, that parents who wish to protect their children by using vaccines that were derived using fetal tissue should feel free to go ahead and do so and put their children's interests ahead of all other concerns.
Madam Chairman, could I
Yes,
offer
go
a
ahead.
correction to that one? I hesitate to have Ms. Charo corrected on the interpretation of Vatican statements, but in fact, that isn't what the Vatican said. What they actually said was because the danger to pregnant women would be so great that, and their fetuses, that children could be immunized with this, not so much for the protection of the children themselves from getting rubella, but from spreading it to pregnant women and their babies.
Okay. Professor Charo, did you have anything else to add?
No, I'm happy to accept the notion that their concern was not for the child who's getting vaccinated, but for the future children who might be affected when pregnant women get infected from the unvaccinated child.
Okay. Dr. Donovan, anything?
It wasn't a lack of concern for children getting vaccinated. Vaccines, all us pediatricians think vaccines are wonderful things and everybody ought to get lots of them. But in fact, the reason that such a moral change could occur, such an exception could be offered, was because it was truly life or death for the pregnant woman's baby. And that's who needed the protection, and therefore the exception could be made. They still are quite in
Thank
favor
you.
of other vaccinations.
My time has expired. At this time, I yield 5 minutes for questions to Ms. Schakowsky.
Thank you. The Los Angeles Times reporter and columnist Michael Hiltzik wrote in September of last year that it, quote, would be a moral outrage, unquote, if fetal tissue research became, quote, collateral damage in the campaign against Planned Parenthood, unquote. He also quotes you, Professor Charo, as saying, quote, we have a duty to use fetal tissue for research and therapy, and that duty includes taking advantage of avenues of hope for current and future patients, particularly if those avenues are being threatened by a purely political fight, unquote. So let me ask you, can you explain, Dr. Charo, the view that there actually is an affirmative duty to use available avenues of research? And if you could please address how this might come into play with the Zika virus and research to understand and find a solution to what the World Health Organization has classified as a, quote, public health emergency of international concern, unquote.
Thank you, Ms. Schakowsky, for the question. The United States health policy is directed at improving the quality of public health. It's considered a compelling purpose under every possible regime of both law, legislative, and judicial. And in this particular instance, this research has proven itself capable of preventing millions of diseases and has shown tremendous promise across a range of illnesses. From my perspective, if we are dedicated to improving the health and welfare of our population, this means pursuing avenues of research that might improve our resistance to disease or our ability to manage or even cure diseases. Now, that is always balanced against other interests, and I understand and appreciate the depth of concerns about abortion that are expressed here at this table and by many other Americans. But because this research in no way affects the number of abortions, it seems to me that we are balancing a compelling public health need against what is simply a gesture of sentiment, respect, political position, or other kind of non-concrete effect against the possible cure for diseases. Now, with regard to Zika, I think it brings it really into focus because right now we are struggling to understand exactly how the Zika virus operates, how it is that it can be transmitted through the placenta to the fetus, how it is that it can affect fetal development at different stages of gestation, and how it can be managed, how we can understand what kinds of outcomes it will have. For that, we need to actually look at the tissue available after every stage of gestation where there actually has been a termination of pregnancy, whether through miscarriage or through elective abortion. If we don't do that, we are facing, as you said, a global emergency in which pregnant women will be forced to choose between risking the birth of a child with devastating effects or, in fact, terminating her pregnancy. Irony being that the absence of this fetal tissue research might lead to more pregnancy terminations than anybody has ever contemplated up until now. I think we need to look very hard at the unintended effects of restricting this research.
So are you saying then that without fetal tissue research, we can't really understand the effect on fetuses?
Because I'm not a research scientist, I don't want to answer definitively, but I can say that looking at the NIH website, looking at the CDC website, and looking at the information put out by other national governments, it seems clear that there's a global consensus. It is very important to study exactly how the virus operates, both at the earliest and latest stages of pregnancy, in order to understand how we might either stop it or treat it.
Let me also ask you, if the remains of the fetus are not used for fetal tissue research, what happens to it?
The tissue is discarded. There are a variety of methods. Some involve burial, others involve cremation. There are a few states that have very specific legislation about the management of fetal remains, but they are not used in any way that is helpful to anybody outside of the possibility of using them for this research.
And let me ask you a question, since we're talking about ethics. Does the fact that fetal tissue research is now under attack and at risk of being shut down warrant our moral outrage?
I am outraged at the idea that we would sacrifice valuable research and that we would gamble with the lives of patients today and tomorrow, gamble with our own lives and gamble with the lives of the people in our family and our communities, because we are trying to fight a deeper battle about our common view on the moral and legal status of the fetus. Again, I can only say again and again, the number of abortions in the United States will be unaffected by the outcome of this discussion about whether to use the remains for research. The only thing we know is that we will lose the benefit of the research for people who do in fact get sick.
I thank you so much. And Madam Chair, I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record the Los Angeles Times article that I've been discussing titled Planned Parenthood and the Cynical Attack on Fetal Tissue Research.
So ordered.
Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. At this time, I recognize Chairman Pitts. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. First of all, Dr. Charo's written statement that the success of fetal tissue is, quote, unimpeachable, end quote, is not completely accurate. The Nobel Prize given to Enders, Weller, and Robbins in 1954 was for showing that poliovirus could be grown in fetal tissue in the laboratory, not for developing the polio vaccine. In fact, the original Salk and Sabin vaccines were raised in monkey tissues, not human fetal tissue. And she conflates the use of fresh aborted fetal tissue with the use of fetal cell lines. And while a few cell lines, which did originate from an abortion, were used in the past for production of some vaccines, only a few modern vaccines utilize these old fetal cell lines, and none use fresh aborted fetal tissue. In fact, the CDC and other leading medical authorities have noted that, quote, no new fetal tissue is needed to produce cell lines to make these vaccines, now or in the future, end quote. The new successful vaccine against Ebola virus, announced last summer, was made using monkey tissue, not fetal tissue or fetal cell lines. So, Dr. Donovan, looking at modern vaccines, do you see any need for use of fresh aborted fetal tissue for vaccine production?
I think your statement was absolutely accurate, that yes, these have been of use in the past. There are other cell lines, there are other means of producing vaccines, and so there is no need to use fetal tissue to produce new cell lines for vaccine production. Moreover, I think it may be a bit disingenuous to say that millions of lives have been saved because these vaccines were produced in the past. Millions of doses have been given and millions of infections have been prevented. Most of those would not have resulted in serious injury to the person immunized or death, certainly. That doesn't mean we shouldn't still be immunizing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. At what point, and you can continue, Dr. Donovan, at what point in human development does science show one is a human being? And why is this?
Well, we really have to go back to one's definition. You know, if we're talking about is it human in terms of having a full complement of cells, you know, that develop continually into you know, fully grown adults. That happens at the zygote stage.
Well, let me go a little further. Is there a point in the baby's gestation at which researchers most want fetal tissue for research? And why is this?
And that I'm not sure that I can answer accurately, so I won't.
Is there any scientific evidence that unborn babies at a later stage feel pain? And should the knowledge of a baby's ability to feel pain by certain points in development affect the ethics surrounding fetal tissue collection from induced abortion?
I think the evidence for fetal pain is very strong, and we're seeing good evidence at 18 to 20 weeks of gestation that fetuses can respond with pain responses. And I think no matter how you feel about a fetus, you know, you can accept its humanity, you can reject its humanity, but we wouldn't allow kittens and puppies to be harmed or put to sleep without keeping them out of pain. I don't think we should do that for fetuses either.
Yeah. Ms. Cunningham, did you want to add something to that?
No, thank you.
All right. Well, I appreciate your testimony about unborn children are the most vulnerable in the human family, and they're deserving of respect and protection. Yet, you know, we see they're legally, they're destroyed in abortions and then either thrown away or traded like a commodity. And it's our duty to protect them, not facilitate the market for their case. My time's expired, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
And at this point, I yield 5 minutes to Ms. DeGette for questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I want to thank all the members of the panel for coming and presenting your different perspectives, because I think talking about ethics in these situations is important. Dr. Donovan, I believe you testified, and I only have 5 minutes, so yes or no will suffice most of the time. I believe you testified that you're not a research scientist. Is that correct?
Although I have been.
No, yes or no will work. You're not
Yep.
a research scientist. Thank you. And Ms. Cunningham, you're an ethicist. Is that correct?
Yes, in the most part.
Yes. Now, Dr. Donovan, I believe that you are philosophically opposed to abortion. Is that correct?
Yes.
And Ms. Cunningham, you are also philosophically opposed to abortion, right?
Yes.
Now, Dr. Donovan, do you believe that fetal tissue research should be banned in this country, yes or no?
It depends on where you get the tissue. No.
So you don't believe it should be banned. Okay, what about you, Ms. Cunningham?
I can't give a yes or no answer to that.
So you
Some
all-
should be banned.
Some should, well, which should be banned?
That is unethically derived, that uses unethically derived
Well,
tissue.
okay, tell me which fetal tissue research is ethically derived.
That which uses fetuses that are donated after an ectopic pregnancy is removed.
Oh,
or
okay, but,
stillbirth
okay,
or
so
miscarriage.
do you think that fetal tissue research from abortions should be banned?
In its current practice, yes.
And Dr. Donovan, thank you for helping me clarify. Do you think fetal tissue from abortions should be banned?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Donovan, you testified that we have cell lines that have been developed over the last 50 years from fetal tissue research, correct?
Correct.
Do you think, is it your position, since those cell lines were developed from aborted fetal tissue 50 years ago, that since it was so long ago, it's okay to use that research now? Is that what you were trying to tell us?
In the absence of alternatives, then it can be acceptable when it is far
I see.
removed.
So because the abortions were a long time ago, it's okay that we use that tissue now, correct?
It's a little more complex than that.
I see. Okay. Now, you also testified that, well, actually, I believe it was you who talked about the Tuskegee and the Mengele experiments. Do you make fetal tissue research from abortions equal to those experiments?
I think that we need to be very careful.
Do you
so
think
that
that
we
they're
don't do
equal,
that.
yes or no? Yes or no?
Maybe.
Thank you. Now, I want to talk with you, Ms. Charo, for a minute. You testified about the your view of the ethics of fetal tissue research from abortions. You mentioned the NIH panel on human fetal transportation research during the Reagan administration. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe it was
Yeah.
HHS and not NIH specifically,
Okay,
but yes.
HHS. And in fact, that blue ribbon panel unanimously endorsed the position that fetal tissue research is not only ethical, but should proceed. Is that correct?
I believe the vote was 19-0.
Yes, it was unanimous. And the chair of that commission was actually opposed to abortion. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the reason was, as you testified a minute ago, because abortion is legal in this country, and so people thought we should be able to give the opportunity to people who had made that legal choice to have an abortion to then donate that tissue to help save other lives. Is that correct?
Yes.
Because as you testified, the alternative when somebody chose to have an abortion, if they did not donate that tissue, was the tissue would be destroyed as medical waste. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And that, in fact, is why many people do make the ethical choice to donate the tissue. Is that right?
I believe so.
Now, I wanted to ask you one more thing, which is, from an ethical standpoint, do you think that it makes any difference when cell lines were developed, whether it was 50 years ago or last year, from tissue from abortions?
In this circumstance, I do not think so, because the prospect of research in the future or the existence of research in the past is equally indifferent to the question of whether a woman would decide to have an abortion. That decision is not affected by the research or the prospect of it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Gentlelady yields back. At this time, I recognize Ms. Black for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank all the panelists for being here today. I want to begin by saying that I've spent my entire career as a nurse, worked in the emergency room most of that time, and it was my responsibility when I was in the emergency room, before we had the organ procurement organizations to come and talk with the family members, it was my responsibility when someone was deceased to look them in the eyes and ask them if they would consider donating their family member for research or transplantation. It was a very sensitive time, and I've got to tell you that as I think about those times, I can actually see the eyes in the people that I ask this of. And one of the things that I will always remember is the dignity and the respect for those family members. Families, actually, there was a report done in Office of Inspector General, and if I may insert this into the record, that looked at informed consent and tissue donation and what the expectations and the realities were of these family members. And here are the things that were found in there, and I don't think it'll surprise any of us, because if we have someone we love that dies either expectedly or unexpectedly, is a very traumatic thing. What organs will be procured? Will the body be treated with respect? And special care to ensure that the gift is used for the stated purpose. Those are the three main things that were found in both this reports and also my experiences. Very tender times, and as I say, a dignity of life and respect for that. I am curious that we don't have that same dignity and respect for the life of what we call tissue and fetus and embryo. This is a baby. I think Ms. Charo mentioned this, that these are the remains. Tissue is discarded. This is not tissue, this is a baby. You don't get a brain, a liver, a kidney, all of these organs from a tissue. It is a baby, it's not a blob of tissue. Now, what I want to go to is if we could put up an Exhibit F. In these documents, documents were produced to the panel by a leading university to show that a researcher sought from a tissue procurement business, quote, a first trimester human embryo, preferably around 8 and up to 10 weeks of gestation. And I think you all may have that in front of you, but the document is Exhibit F, and this is what it looks like. It actually says doctor, and the name of the doctor is blacked out, at the University of, would request a first trimester human embryo, preferably 8 to 10 weeks of gestation. We have ordered tissue before, so our information should be on file. Please let us know if this tissue is available. This is not dignity. This is not dignity. This is not respect for human life. I want to ask the panelists, have we reached a point in our society where there effectively is an Amazon.com for human parts, including entire babies? And I'd like to ask our panel for their opinion on this email and the notion of obtaining potentially entire embryos on demand. Dr. Donovan, would you like to address this?
I personally find that it shocks my conscience, and I think it should shock the conscience of the nation. I think you're absolutely right. You know, we have commodified what have been referred to as the products of conception, meaning babies and baby parts. And yes, they are for sale, supposedly just to cover one's costs, but those costs seem to be quite variable. But even if they were given away free, it's shocking to be ordering what you want. Can I have a boy fetus or a girl fetus or a brain or a heart or a liver? This is totally in distinction to the honorable transplantation industry that is life-saving and shows great respect for the donors.
Ms. Cunningham.
I think what we need to pay attention to here is not, is this somehow increasing abortion? My concern is that researchers have come to count on induced abortion for their research. And one of the articles that I cited in my written testimony shows that they say that liver from induced abortions is widely available and is a promising source. What have we come to where researchers need induced abortion to do their research? Wouldn't it have been better if we had banned this at the beginning and used the creative minds that we have
And Ms. Cunningham, I hate to cut
find
you off, but I
ethical
have
alternatives?
Thank you, and I just have one brief comment to make because my time is going to end here in just a second. I believe that we should give the same information and dignity to these young women that are making these decisions. And I believe that it should be a more informed and educational decision that they are making, and I don't believe that is happening currently. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Ms. Spear, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for your participation today. You know, today I feel like a time traveler, not a member of Congress. Perhaps we have been transported back to 1692 to the Salem witch trials, where fanatics persecuted and murdered innocent people who had committed no offenses. Or maybe we've been transported back to the Red Scare, where at least 10,000 Americans in many professions around this country lost their livelihoods due to the reckless and disgraceful actions of the House on Un-American Activities Committee and the infamous Senator Joseph McCarthy, who eventually went after an Army General Counsel, Mr. Welch. And Mr. Welch finally put down Senator McCarthy by saying, "Have you no decency?" Unfortunately, this time, those being burned at the stakes are our scientists who hold future medical breakthroughs in their hands. They are joined by brave women's healthcare providers who are simply trying to care for their patients. Meanwhile, David DeLayden and his associate Sandra Merritt fraudulently created the Center for Medical Progress, and they were indicted in Texas by a grand jury for actual illegal activities. They are the reason why we are here today. Illegal conduct by two people. They've now been indicted, and that's been the creation of this committee. And I have here a poster that shows what they've been indicted for. They've been indicted for 2 felonies for tampering with government records. In California, they are being investigated for any number of felonies, including misrepresentation of one's company to the IRS, felonies for fraud in creating fake driver's licenses and credit card fraud identity. And a judge in California has made this statement in granting a motion for a preliminary injunction by saying, Defendants engaged in repeated instances of fraud, including the manufacture of fake documents, the creation and registration with the state of California of a fake company, and repeated false statements in order to infiltrate and implement their human capital project. The product of that project, achieved in large part from infiltration, thus far have not been pieces of journalistic integrity, but misleading edited videos and unfounded assertions. So my question to you, Dr. Donovan, is this. You're an expert on ethics, as is Ms. Cunningham and Ms. Charo. Do you think it is appropriate to conduct oneself in that manner? Is that ethical? Is that moral? Yes or no?
Most ethical and moral questions are not yes and no questions.
Well, we've been asking yes and no questions this morning.
I've
Please
noticed
answer.
that. I've noticed that. It doesn't always help one unpeel the onion in order to get to the truth. So if you want a yes or no, I'm not quite sure how to answer that as a yes and no. You know, where is the greater damage? I'm not an expert on journalistic ethics, and I'm certainly not an expert on the law. I am glad that
Well, let me ask you this.
carrying a false driver's license isn't a felony everywhere, or many college students would end up in jail.
Do you think committing fraud is ethical?
Of course, fraud is not ethical.
All right.
Neither is what was
Miss-
being investigated.
Ms. Cunningham,
And the
is fraud,
specific
is
question,
committing fraud ethical?
as a broad statement, one would say it is not ethical, but I'm not answering the specific question about the conduct of David DeLayden.
So you think Mr. DeLayden is ethical?
As Dr. Donovan said, that's a very
All right,
broad statement. I
thank
can't
you.
answer it in the way that you're asking.
Professor Charo?
I think the attempt to deliberately create distorted videos for political purpose and to tarnish an organization that helps millions of women was profoundly unethical and destructive.
I thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. At this time, Dr. Bouchon, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to say I was a practicing cardiovascular and thoracic surgeon for 15 years prior to coming to Congress, and thank you all the witnesses for being here. I also want to say that it's totally appropriate to reevaluate and examine ethical issues that have been examined in the past. Times do change, and so I know some of the narrative has been that in the past people have looked at these issues and come to conclusions, but in healthcare particularly, I think it's important that we occasionally re-examine these issues. The other thing is based on some of the comments of the Democrat colleagues, I'm not sure what everyone's so afraid of, because, you know, this type of discussion about ethics is totally appropriate, and we don't have a preconceived outcome. And I would also just remind everybody in the crowd that charges and indictments don't mean convictions and guilt. With that, I would like to go to Exhibit B1 and go over some emails. In the first, and you may have those, in the first to the customer, this is between a tissue technician and a customer. I'm going to walk you through this. We're now ready to include the skull, so if you would please include that in our order for tomorrow, that would be great. If there is a case tomorrow, could you please have someone contact me with the condition of both the long bones and the calvarium, which is the head. And I will be happy to let you know if we would like one or both. 4 minutes later, the technician responds, I would be happy to do that. Exhibit B2. The customer replied a day later, just want to check in and see if there were any cases within our gestational range for today. The technician responded 4 minutes later, there is one case currently in the room. I will let you know how the limbs and calvarium look to see if they're able to take them, which means they're discussing actively during the abortion itself. 3 minutes later, the client said, great, thank you so much. Exhibit B3, after the abortion is performed, the technician tells the customer, the calvarium, the head, is mostly intact with a tear up the back suture line, but all pieces look to be there. The limbs, one upper, one lower, are totally intact, with one upper broken at the humerus, which is the upper arm bone, and one lower broken, lower limb broken above the knee. Please let me know if these are acceptable. I'll set them aside, and we'll wait for your reply. 5 minutes later, the customer replies, that sounds great. We would like both of them. Please send them our way. Thanks again. The technician says limbs and calvarium will be there at 3:30 to 4 o'clock. And we'll hear later in testimony, and there's evidence to show that technicians are partially paid by the number of body parts that they could get. So given that, did these emails raise any ethical issues? And if so, what are they? Dr. Donovan?
Once again, I think that what we are seeing is a total lack of respect for the dignity of the human body in this case. Because as we've already pointed out, not only are these humans, but these are human body parts, otherwise no one would be interested in them. But to order them, you know, piece by piece, like you'd order a McDonald's hamburger, I find discouraging and shocking.
Ms. Cunningham?
I do find a number of serious ethical problems, one being, apart from the question of abortion itself, I think this completely fails to isolate abortion from the decision about the fetal tissue and consent to use of the fetal tissue. In what we see here, there is no indication of consent prior to this procedure or for these specific parts to be excised.
In fairness, that could have occurred earlier, I guess.
It could, I just said there's nothing here to indicate that.
Ms. Charo?
I would just like to add a little bit of context, because exactly the same kind of language would be used if we were talking about people ordering tissue from adults who had died and were now having their bodies used for tissue and organ recovery. It's the same kind of clinical, dispassionate language that is deeply upsetting to many of us who are not in that world and are not familiar with that. As you as a physician have said, there's a world of difference in how we talk about things. And
Okay, well, I appreciate that.
yeah, and there's a world of tissue transplantation and tissue research with adult tissue out there that is enormous and is very little different from what we are seeing here. So just a little context about how this all
Sure,
works.
and I'd like to say, as a physician, you know, during my training, I spent a lot of time on transplantation, both talking to recipients and also family members of people who were in an unfortunate situation, making a decision on behalf of their loved one to donate organs. And you know, I think that talking about a human being with, you know, like this, just the mere fact that the arm was broke and the leg was broke, and they're talking about the head separately of a human being, is something to me that that's pretty hard to take as a physician. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Delbene, you're recognized for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being with us today. I'd like to start by dispelling any misconceptions about this hearing and this committee's investigation. You know, it's definitely not objective or impartial in any way. This taxpayer-funded committee was created by Republicans more than 4 months ago after a group of anti-choice extremists made a series of false, unsubstantiated allegations about Planned Parenthood. Since that time, 4 different congressional committees and a grand jury tried and failed to uncover any evidence of wrongdoing. And their anti-choice accusers have been indicted on felony charges. Meanwhile, the majority has deliberately ignored this growing body of evidence and has clearly decided to continue spending taxpayer dollars to attack women's health and intimidate healthcare providers across the country. Now, in the committee's first hearing, the majority would like our constituents to believe we're conducting an objective hearing on medical research, and that couldn't be further from the truth. What we're really doing is reopening a long-settled debate about research to further a broader political agenda against a woman's right to choose. And if their attacks on science succeed, then we'll all pay the price, because nearly every American has benefited from research conducted with fetal tissue. It's how we developed the first ever polio vaccine. It's how we make vaccines for rubella, chickenpox, and shingles. It's how scientists are pursuing new treatments for heartbreaking diseases like Alzheimer's and HIV. And it's all done in full compliance with the high ethical standards recommended by President Reagan's Blue Ribbon Panel in 1998, which were passed by Congress with broad bipartisan support. So as someone, I started my career in doing medical research. And I know that research using all human tissue is subject to ethical and legal standards. Professor Charo, do you agree with that?
I do. I do.
And Professor, do you think it's appropriate to use ideology about women's rights to shape the rules that guide scientific research, and why or why not?
No, I'm very, very unhappy at seeing a debate around abortion turn into a debate around scientific research. That's not to say I'm happy about the debate about abortion either, because I also find it really offensive to imagine that women are incapable of making their own decisions about whether to have an abortion and whether or not to donate the tissue. But for sure, while that is going on, scientific research ought not be halted or hindered simply as an attempt to demonstrate one's opposition to abortion rights in a either political or public relations manner. It doesn't change anything, and I don't think that the public should be made a victim of those abortion wars.
Can you speak a little bit about the role of institutional review boards in providing oversight on the use of human tissue in research? You know, how do they help ensure that research is compliant with ethical and legal standards?
So, like Dr. Donovan, I've been a member of an institutional review board off and on for many years, and those boards look at a variety of things, starting with how it is that people are first approached and asked about whether or not they'd like to participate in research, or in this case, to donate materials. It looks at the nature of the conversation that will be had, the documentation, because of course what's on paper is not the extent of the conversation. It's simply the minimum number of items that need to be documented as far as the consent form goes. It looks at whether or not in the end there has been compliance. There are often research monitors that will observe a certain number of interactions in order to ensure compliance. There's an annual review that is required for each research protocol, and sometimes reviews are done more frequently depending upon the protocol. The Institutional Review Board is made up of a variety of people from both scientific and clinical and non-medical backgrounds, including law, ethics, religious studies, and members of the community who can reflect the local community culture in those discussions.
And that has been something that also the Blue Ribbon Commission looked at and made sure that those boards were appropriate, and that was part of that that debate that they had and the decision they had from the commission.
Yes, institutional review boards are actually required by law. It begins with the use of federal funds that will trigger such a requirement, or the research into things that are regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. But most major research institutions now have extended that review beyond the legal requirements in order to give what is called a federal-wide assurance of all research at that institution complying with these same rules, even where not legally necessary.
Thank you so much. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Gentlelady yields back. Dr. Harris, you're recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. You know, and I am a physician, and I was a physiology researcher. I actually did fetal research, but it was at fetal sheep. It was cerebral blood flow. And I also was a human principal investigator who actually had to file IRB applications. I don't intend to, litigate the use of fetal tissue, because I suspect we all agree about this. And I'm just going to, Dr. Donovan, Ms. Cunningham, when you said the question about fetal tissue, I assume you support fetal tissue research from spontaneously aborted fetuses, correct?
Correct.
Correct.
Yes.
Okay, so we all agree. Let's all agree this is not litigating fetal tissue research. We all agree it should be done. Now, Dr. Donovan, let me just say, I was fascinated by because what we're talking about here is consent, and whether IRB consent and patient consent, whether that's all adequate. And the idea that when you're a guardian of someone, that you are qualified to give consent because you have the global best interest of that person in mind, has to be brought into question when it's an elective abortion. I mean, it just has to be. And with regards to the millions of people saved by fetal tissue research, we're all talking about the vaccines, the 2 cell lines. 1 cell line, interesting, a female child aborted because the family was too big. I would proffer that mother, that if you gave that child and that child could somehow give consent, they'd never consent to that abortion. The second one is a male which was aborted for, quote, psychiatric reasons. Now, when I had to get IRB approval on a patient, I had to be careful about approaching a patient with psychiatric illness, because a lot of people feel they don't have the ability to give consent. So it was a very good point you made. Let me just talk a little bit about an IRB question, specifically for you, Dr. Donovan. Is the source of fetal tissue or how it is acquired a valid question that an IRB should have answered before they approve a project?
It's not only a valid question, it is asked and has to be answered. Some institutions would absolutely forbid its use.
So that if there were an instance where the application was, let's say, massaged a little bit, so that it was a little unclear what the source was, in an attempt to bypass that, that would really bypass the intention of an IRB. Is that right? If you, for instance, you didn't call it exactly what it was or what could be readily identified as the source.
Yes, you clearly know what you're talking about. Yeah. And in fact, would that occur, the investigator would be in trouble with the IRB. They would be called in and questioned about it.
Sure. Let's look at Exhibit A3, which is a commonly used form for fetal tissue donation that was uncovered through discovery by the committee. Ms. Cunningham, when I had to get consent from patients, because we obtained human tissue at a cesarean section, human uterine tissue, we normally exactly described the tissue and then really kind of exactly described what it was going for. It could be global. It could be, okay, it's to study, in this case it was to study uterine myocytes and their effect on preterm labor. Do you find anywhere on that form where it I mean, I'll tell you, I don't see anywhere where it asks specifically what tissue it is. In the case brought up by Dr. Bouchon, I assume that at that abortion, they didn't go to the mother before and say, oh, by the way, we're going to collect an arm and a leg, and we're going to do it for this kind of research. Is that something you think part of informed consent ought to be, that you actually know where this tissue is going and for what?
Yes, I'm not the only one. If you look at elements of fetal tissue donation consent, in other contexts, it's quite specific on what is being discussed with the prospective donor or their family.
Absolutely. Ms. Charo.
I'm
to the point that the gentlelady, no, I'm not, I have to ask the question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
To the point from the gentlelady from Tennessee. When my wife passed away a year and a half ago, I got a call from the medical examiner's office requesting donation of her brain. It was a tough call. But it was, they specified one tissue, and they specified what was going to be done with it. Now you look at Exhibit A3, and then you look at Exhibit C1 and C2, which are actually what various anatomical donation forms are used by states. It's strikingly different. Strikingly different. Do you think that it really ought to be included when you ask someone, a woman, to donate the fetal tissue, that you perhaps suggest specifically what it's going for and what the specific tissues to be used are going to be? If the person knows, or should they make a best effort to know?
I'm not sure. I think
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentleman yells it back. Ms. Watson-Coleman, you are recognized for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I have a question for Dr. Donovan and for Ms. Cunningham, and I'd appreciate yes or no. I need to understand, are you suggesting that it is more moral and more ethical to discard fetal tissue that is available even after an abortion that a woman decided to have, rather than use it for medical research purposes? Is that a yes or a no?
That's not a yes or a no.
Is that a yes or a no? Do you believe that let me ask it this way, do you believe that fetal tissue that has been derived from a woman's decision to abort should be used for medical purposes or not? Is that a yes or a no, sir?
That's not a yes or no question.
Why, Ms. Cunningham, do you agree or disagree that fetal tissue that is available as a result of a woman deciding to have an abortion should be used or discarded? Used for medical research purposes or discarded?
I'm sorry, what am I saying?
What is it that you all don't understand? I understand.
Would you like an
Well, a
answer
yes
to
or
your
no
question?
can't answer used or discarded. I'm sorry.
Used for medical research purposes or discarded and not used for any purpose? Eliminated, trashed, thrown away, as opposed to used for medical research purposes, to find whether or not a cure can be found for Zika, a cure can be found for some other disease. Do you believe that it is moral to discard that tissue rather than use it? Is that a clear enough question?
Thank you. Because I'm under oath, I cannot answer yes or no question. What I can say is that it is currently being practiced. I do not believe it is ethically possible to do so.
Dr. Charo, may I please have your sort of sense of what you just heard from both of these individuals with regard to the use or the discarding of fetal tissue that is a result of a woman's decision to have an abortion?
I will stand corrected because I am speaking for other people, but I think I heard that they are uncomfortable with both outcomes, but given only those two choices, they would discard rather than use for fetal tissue for a variety of reasons having to do with why they oppose fetal tissue research. But I have to say, I have to yield to you to explain what it is that you actually meant to say.
Thank you.
Well, I wouldn't mind hearing that if you could say it succinctly, because I do have a number of questions.
I'm as succinct as I can be. You asked one of the most complex ethical questions. What do we do with the information or products of medical research when we think the research itself is tainted?
It's not what I asked.
That is what you asked, whether you realized
no,
it or
sir,
not.
No, I know what I asked. I asked, do you think that it is better to discard the tissue that would result from an abortion, that a woman made a decision to abort, as opposed to a spontaneous abortion, an ectopic pregnancy aborted? Do you think it is moral to throw it away rather than use it for purposes of discovering cures, discovering treatments, et cetera? If you can give me a yes or no, I'll take it. If not, I want to move on to the next question.
Few questions, moral questions, are yes or no questions. That one certainly is not.
Thank you very much. Professor Charo, we've heard about what's happened as a result of those videos that have been released. We know what has happened with regard to Delighten and those videos, and we know that it has created harassment and fear and whatnot. As a matter of fact, the dean of your School of Medicine said that his faculty has been compared to Nazi war criminals because they use fetal tissue for research. Does it surprise you that the researchers have come under attack and the healthcare providers and doctors also were under attack? And could you give me a close yes or no?
It does not surprise me.
And what do you feel about that comparison?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to say something I've wanted very much to say. My family was personally touched by the Holocaust. I lost a grandparent in the camps. I grew up in a neighborhood where people wore tattoos on their arms that represented the years in the camps. These were people who were alive and were aware and were suffering for the years that they were in those camps. I am profoundly, profoundly distressed and frankly offended
Thank you,
at
Doctor.
the thought of comparing that to the experience of loss
Professor,
of an embryo or
I
fetus.
just thank you very much. Madam Chair, may I have 30 seconds? Thank you very much. Because I simply wanted to say, Madam Chair, that we believe your efforts to compile this database of names is very dangerous. We believe that linking people to this investigation is very dangerous. And we think that the characterization of unlawful sale of baby body parts is very dangerous. And we're disappointed that Republicans tabled our motion and that you would not answer Mr. Nadler's question when he asked you why you thought this was important. Thank you.
Expired. At this point, I recognize Ms. Hartzler for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I would just say, based on the comments that were just made, that just a reminder that babies who are aborted are normally buried or cremated. It is not discarded. And so to follow this premise, you would be saying that to bury a loved one rather than donating to science is immoral. And I clearly reject that. We have to treat these babies with the dignity that they deserve. And I think the logic is flawed to say just because you don't donate a loved one to science, it's immoral. But I want to talk a little bit about the consent. I was a former teacher for many years working with teenagers, some that had a time in their life when they had an unexpected pregnancy, and these are very difficult issues. So I would like to put up Exhibit E, start with Exhibit D, and say this question will start off with Mrs. Cunningham. The Secretary of HHS issued the Belmont report, which says that consent is valid only if voluntarily given, and that, quote, inducements that would ordinarily be acceptable may become undue influences if the subject is especially vulnerable. So if you could put up Exhibit A3, the consent form that is used in some of these clinics. I would like to ask you, in your view, does this form violate our government's own guidance in its inducement to women considering abortion, especially with the promise and the statement in the very first opening of the consent form says research using the blood from pregnant women and tissue that has been aborted has been used to treat and find a cure for such diseases as diabetes, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, cancer, and AIDS. I'll say I lost my mother last year with Alzheimer's. I am not aware that there is a cure out there. This was news to me. And so, Mrs. Cunningham, do you think that this consent form complies with HHS's mandate against inducement?
It would be interesting to know from the women's perspective. Thank you. It would be interesting to know from the women's perspective if this does induce her to sign the form, this idea of the promise of cures, which is a very powerful motivator. The concern I have is that the standards that we have typically for fetal tissue donation are just absent here. And so in addition to the voluntariness, there's just the thoroughness of the consent seems to be missing in this form.
I would concur with the HHS informed consent checklist itself that is online. A couple of other requirements there's supposed to be of consent is a statement describing the extent of any to which confidentiality of records identifying the subject will be maintained. I see no such statement in this exhibit. It also says research rights and injury and explanation of whom to contact for answers to pertinent questions about the research subjects' rights. If I was a teenage girl in a crisis situation, they're being presented with this form, I don't see it there. Do you see it on the form?
I do not.
Okay. Ms. Charo, last August, speaking about fetal tissue research while at a NARAL conference, you were quoted as saying, now remember, this is not about using an actual embryo or an actual fetus. This is leftover tissue after the fetus is long dead. Please put up Exhibit E. In this email, the tissue procurement manager of a tissue business described to a university researcher the immediacy of obtaining tissue from aborted fetuses. The manager wrote that after, quote, the doctor determines the abortion is complete, the procurement technician is allowed to begin procurement. This takes a couple of minutes. So given these comments from the tissue procurer, how can you contend that tissue procurement occurs, quote, after the fetus is long dead?
I don't recall speaking at a NARAL conference last August, but there was a conference I spoke at considerably longer ago, speaking of length of time, and I believe that that comment was being made in the context of the cell lines, which really are from fetuses that were aborted a very, very long time ago. But I don't have a transcript of my own remarks with me. Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Donovan, isn't the tissue harvested immediately after the cells, are they still alive? The cells are still alive?
Absolutely, they want fresh cells.
Okay. Very good. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Nadler, you're recognized. 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Charo, I should first say that I find most of this discussion irrelevant because it relates to the morality of abortion. Opinions differ, obviously, on the morality of abortion. I, for one, think abortions are perfectly moral. But that is not the question. Abortion is legal and as a consequence safe for women in this country. The law already prohibits initiating a pregnancy for purpose of donating tissue. A hypothetical concern is we have never heard of this actually happening. The question before us is about fetal tissue research. But if the abortion was going to happen anyway, now, Mr. Harris or Dr. Harris pointed out, Dr. Donovan agreed, that we all agree that fetal tissue research is valuable. But if the disagreement may be over the source. But if the abortion was going to happen anyway, even if you don't like that fact, how can it be immoral to save lives by use of fetal tissue from an abortion that would have happened anyway, tissue that would otherwise be thrown away? What makes the use to save lives instead of throwing it away immoral, Ms. Charo?
There's been a great deal of conversation about the notion of complicity with an underlying act one considers to be immoral, and it's at this point I think it's helpful to take an example of an act that I think is universally understood to be immoral and not one that is debated, which is the case of abortion. If we talk about the murder of an adult, which we all consider to be immoral and is also a criminal act, so it's also not legal, there is no question that we use those tissues and organs from murder victims for organ transplantation, for tissue transplantation, and for organ and tissue research without in any sense feeling complicit. We don't encourage murder by virtue of using those tissues. We may not condone it, but we certainly don't view it as something that should be abandoned because we don't want any connection with an underlying act of which we disapprove. So I find the arguments about complicity to be unpersuasive.
So by the same logic, whether you think abortion is immoral or not, use of fetal tissue that would be there in any event for moral purposes is no more moral or immoral than use of tissues from a murder victim.
That was the reasoning of the panel that was led by Judge Adams for President Reagan, and that is a kind of reasoning that does not appear to have been affected by events in the last 30 or 40 years. Science changes, but that particular analysis seems to have been consistent.
Let me quote from Ms. Cunningham's testimony, and she said it is, and this is a subquote from a book by Robert George and Christopher Tollefson, it is, quote, morally impermissible to engage in any research for any purpose that involves the destruction of human beings at any stage of their lives, including the embryonic stage, or in any condition, however weak or dependent, unsubquote. Ms. Cunningham continues, those who are responsible for terminating the life of a fetus have failed to recognize this fundamental principle of human dignity and thus have no moral claim to be able to donate or assign the body, organs, or tissues of the fetus to others, regardless of the nobility of purpose, close quote. Dr. Donovan said something to the same effect. In other words, Ms. Cunningham, Dr. Donovan, Mr. George, who wrote the article, believe that they have a superior moral claim to that of the mother to make this decision. I find this incredibly arrogant. Because of their view of the morality of abortion, they would deprive the mother of her moral agency. Having decided to have an abortion, which is her right under the law, which some of us regard as moral and some people regard as immoral, but it's her decision under the law, they would deprive her, therefore, of the right to make a decision to use the fetal tissue that would otherwise be thrown out for morally good purposes to help save lives. And they would deprive the mother of this moral right because they have a superior moral right. Would you comment on that, Ms. Charo?
Yes, this was exactly the concern that was raised again and again by the Reagan panel, which did a fairly thorough report on a lot of these things. And they looked specifically at whether there's anybody else who is in a superior position to give consent. That could be scientists, it could be physicians, it could be that the material is used without any kind of consent at all and considered abandoned property. And in the end, they concluded that there was no one and no entity and no rule of law that had superior entitlement to make this decision than the woman herself.
Thank you. I have one final question. Dr. Bouchon noted that it is legitimate to re-examine these issues. We had panels a couple of decades ago. We can re-examine the issues. He's right, of course, on that. We can always re-examine an issue. And he said, what are we afraid of? Here's what we are afraid of. We also know that an employee at one of the entities that the chair has subpoenaed, someone who was also identified in connection with the deceptively edited and false videos, has been the victim of a death threat posted online suggesting that he or she should be hung by the neck using piano wire and propped up on the lawn in the front of the lawn, I assume he meant, in the front of the building with a note attached, unquote. That's what we're afraid of, that this kind of proceeding that we're doing with the kinds of obnoxious and illegal and frankly, subpoenas, I think, designed to endanger the lives of people who engage in abortions, That's the danger. Ms. Charo, would you comment on that? And that's my last question.
It's a documented danger. We also saw, as was noted earlier on, the deaths in Colorado immediately following some of these tapes being released. I can say from personal experience, not related to this topic, but other topics I've written on, I've also received threatening calls. And it is incredibly disturbing, and it is a way to intimidate and chill research in the United States.
And make this committee complicit in further acts of violence if they occur.
Gentleman's
Thank you very
time's
much.
expired. Ms. Love, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Across the United States, current federal law prohibits minors under the age of 18 from serving in the military, entering into financially binding contracts, purchasing nicotine, being tried as an adult, getting married, or voting. We have a number of laws in place that protect our minors. This includes prohibiting minors to go into certain movies without a guardian or a parent being around. And all of this is to protect that minor because their brains are not fully developed and they lack the ability to fully comprehend long-term repercussions of their decisions. So, my question, Ms. Cunningham, do you think that ethical guidelines should be in place to protect a minor when they're giving consent to a clinic to perform an abortion? And what kind of guidelines do you think should be in place?
Are you thinking about the abortion procedure itself or the specific issue of consent to donate?
I'm not talking about tissue donation. I'm talking about when they're going in and actually giving consent to even have an abortion performed.
Well, I think, first of all, there should be great care exercise because as the United Kingdom Human Fetal Tissue Authority noted that the time of deciding about abortion is a very emotionally stressful time for a woman. And I have been in a number of conversations with physicians involving informed consent. And it is really helpful to have the second person there taking notes and really paying attention to what is said. My own husband didn't remember what the oncologist said to him, but I took notes and I was able to help him go through the informed consent process. So I think great care would need to be taken in any kind of informed consent proceeding, but especially with a minor.
Okay. Mr. Donovan, with all of this being said, do you think it's important for us to have different consent forms for minors versus adults?
Well, in fact, in medical research, children cannot give consent. They are allowed to give what we refer to as assent, but they also require the permission of the parent involved as well.
Okay. Given what we know today with current laws governing consent from minors, what do you think would be an appropriate age for someone to get an adult consent form as opposed to a minor that is giving consent for an abortion?
Well, at least in research under the law, at 18 they can start giving, signing a consent form, although human development specialists suggest that maybe sometime around age 24, teenagers actually do grow up.
I want to actually concentrate a little bit now on the tissue donation. I have a 14-year-old child. I am not a physician. My expertise is in real life, in the real life aspect. I have this 14-year-old who is a straight A student and makes decisions, great decisions generally, most of the time. And under normal circumstances, I actually asked her to look at this exhibit and try and figure out whether she can fill that form out. My very smart child kept coming back to me asking for explanation, clarification. And those are under normal circumstances. So let me ask you this question. What kind of emotional duress do you think a minor is under in anticipation of an abortion procedure? Just your thoughts. I mean, I can imagine
I'm sorry.
what I would go through. Either one. Ms. Cunningham, this is a great question for you. What kind of duress do you think a minor would be under before having to go under, having to have a procedure, an invasive procedure like an abortion?
Well, having raised a daughter who has survived adolescence, but who has been with her in physician consultations, there is stress over dealing with a sprained arm. There is great stress over going through an x-ray after she fainted. There must be even greater stress in an event that she may be wishing to conceal from others.
Okay, so imagine that 14-year-old going into a clinic to undergo a very invasive procedure without someone there that she trusts to walk her through to make sure that she's not being taken advantage of, to make sure that she's making the right decision. How can anyone be sure that that minor, under difficult circumstances, fully understand the long-term repercussions behind their decision when the current law wouldn't even allow that minor to get behind the wheel of a vehicle?
No, you're pointing out a real discrepancy between the way we deal with the teenagers in our country. I wouldn't be able to take that child and do a procedure on them without the mother or father being there and giving their consent as well. If I did, that would be assault and battery.
Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Duffy, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome, panel. I want to be clear, Ms. Charo, on your testimony, and that is that I think you said there's a compelling public interest in research on fetal tissue. Is that right?
Yes, I said that.
And this is about saving lives, correct?
That is what I said.
Okay. Now, I think I heard you correctly when the chair asked you in the first round of questions about whether there's any ethical violations in regard to using fetal tissue for taste tests, cosmetics, or human and animal DNA testing. And I think Mr. Donovan and Ms. Cunningham expressed concern, but you did not. So could you explain to me the compelling public interest and the life-saving research that takes place when we use fetal tissue for taste tests and cosmetics?
First, I'm referring to the full range of uses, which includes all of the basic science research
I'm
that we hear about.
going to reclaim my time, because this was very specific.
No, actually, the question was whether I thought there was a
reclaiming
compelling
my time.
public interest, and I'm talking
Ms.
about
Charo,
the full range.
the question came specifically from the chair about taste tests and cosmetics and DNA, or human and animal DNA testing. And you didn't express any concern. So do you have a compelling public interest that saves lives in regard to taste tests and cosmetic research using fetal tissue? Yes or no?
I'm going to take a page from you and say, I can't say yes or no because that's not actually what I said. I did not express no concern. I said those uses are probably more frivolous, but they are among the many uses for tissue.
So let me ask you this. Do you think there is a compelling public interest in saving lives if we use fetal tissue for taste tests and cosmetics?
Believe it or not, for taste tests, there might be, because the loss of taste neurologically can actually lead to devastating problems.
And how about cosmetics?
Depends on which cosmetic you're talking about. A lot of those skin grafts are considered aesthetic, but they're also very, very helpful.
Is there any research that you think is inappropriate using fetal tissue?
Well, using any tissue, fetal or adult, I find the cosmetic uses in Hollywood sometimes to be so frivolous, I'd be perfectly happy to see us abandon them.
I want to be clear, because it seems that you are advocating on the behalf of fetal tissue research and stem cells. You've also consulted for companies that are involved in those activities. And the CV you provided in preparation for your testimony in 2002, you were the scientific advisory board of WI-Cell, and in their website it shows that it does stem cell research. In 2012, you were a consultant to Cleveland Biolabs, and in their SEC filings, Cleveland Biolabs says it uses proprietary stem cell lines in its products. And then in 2006, you were a consultant to Stem Cells, Inc. The firm's website says that it uses, quote, human neural stem cells in medicine. A leading university told the panel that it, quote, receives a proprietary cell line derived from fetal tissue that was supplied by Stem Cell, Inc. So you do have a vested financial interest in the boards that you serve on the research of fetal tissue, correct?
I received no funding from Y-Cell. I did receive consulting funding from Cleveland and Stem Cells, Inc.
Okay,
Those were not embryonic stem cells, by the way, that we were talking about.
So you do have a financial interest in?
Not at present, no.
But you have in the past?
I have, and by the way, every dollar of that was donated. You can look at my IRS tax
so
returns.
I want to go to another few issues. So let's say, now, if we could go to Exhibit A1, if we have someone who works for a tissue procurement business, and they're corresponding with an abortion clinic technician, and they're providing a wish list of items that they're going to want to purchase. Things like liver, thymus, skin, to be shipped by FedEx overnight, whether to Harvard or UMass. So you have a wish list, of a shopping list being sent from the tissue provider to the abortion technician. And if we could also go to Exhibit A2. Here's a procurement compensation schedule. So we see the technician gets paid per specimen. And the more specimens you provide, the more money you make. And a side note, I thought that there was no profit motive here. I don't think that per specimen the cost goes up, but the more you provide, the more money you make, above your hourly wage, Exhibit 2A. And then if you go to Exhibit A3, you have the consent form that the technician brings out to the mom to garner consent for the abortion. And I would just note, if the panel would look at their Exhibit A3, anywhere in there does it say that the technician has a financial interest where they obtain $35 per specimen, up to 10 specimens, and $45 per specimen for those from 11 to 20? Does the financial incentive, is that shown in Exhibit A2, or I mean, sorry, A3? If you look at that quickly.
No, it's not there.
Okay. Does that concern you that we have the technician who is receiving the shopping list from the business, and it's also the person that's going to go in and obtain consent from the mom, and there's a financial component to it? Mr. Donovan, does that give you any pause or concern ethically?
Well, I think that you have correctly shown that this would never pass muster for an IRB.
Ms. Cunningham?
Yes, it has ethical problems.
Gentleman's time is
My time has expired. I'm getting gaveled down. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I want to thank our first panel for being with us today. We are ready to move to our second panel, and as the first panel departs, I want to provide unanimous consent so ordered to Ms. Black for her request to enter the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General report on tissue donation into the record, so ordered. As our first panel leaves, we will introduce the second panel as they take their places. Dr. Lee, Dr. Shamanda, and Dr. Goldstein. And I would like to introduce the members of this panel. Dr. Patrick Lee is the John N. and Jamie D. McAleer Professor of Bioethics and the Director of the Center for Bioethics at Franciscan University of Steubenville. Dr. Kathleen M. Shamanda is Professor of Radiology and Professor of Biophysics at the Center for Imaging Research at the Medical College of Wisconsin. And Dr. Lawrence Goldstein is Distinguished Professor, Department of Cellular and Molecular Medicine, Department of Neurosciences at the University of California, San Diego School of Medicine. You are aware that the Select Investigative Panel is holding an investigative hearing and will take your testimony under oath. Do you have any objection to testifying under oath? The chair then advises you that under the rules of the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, you are entitled to be advised by counsel. Do you desire to be advised by counsel during your testimony today? If you will stand to be sworn in. You'll raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. You may be seated. You will each have 8 minutes for your opening statement. Dr. Lee, you may proceed. Microphone, please.
Thank you, Madam Chairman Blackburn, and thank you, distinguished members of the committee, and thank you for this opportunity for speaking on bioethics and fetal tissue. My name is Patrick Lee. I'm the professor of bioethics at Franciscan University of Steubenville, and I have submitted my written testimony. I'll just give a brief summary of the arguments, some of the arguments there. In Roe v. Wade, Justice Blackmun claimed that the court would not settle the question of whether the fetus is a human being or not. And yet, as a practical matter, the court denied to human fetuses the equal protection of the law, and so treated them as, in fact, outside the class of human beings. In fact, however, as the standard text of embryology, developmental biology, and genetics assert, a human embryo or fetus from conception on is a distinct whole human individual. The evidence for this is quite clear. We know that a human embryo or fetus is a human being, a human organism, in basically the same way we know that a six-week-old infant is a human organism. Looking at a six-week-old infant, we can see that first, she is a distinct being, not a part of a larger organism. She is a complete being, although at an immature level of development, since even though she cannot now perform many of the actions that are typical of human beings, she is growing, she is actively developing herself to the point where she will do so. In a similar way, it is clear that a human embryo or a fetus is a distinct being, since she grows in her own distinct direction. She is obviously human, since she has the genetic structure that is characteristics. She has the genetic structure in her cells that is characteristics of humans. And she is a whole human being, as opposed to something that is functionally apart, such as a human cell or human tissue. For unlike a cell or human tissue, she has within her structure, within her genetic and epigenetic structure, all of the internal resources needed to actively develop herself to the mature stage of a human being. This shows that she already is a whole human organism, only at the earliest stage of development. So the same kind of facts that show a six-week-old infant is a human being also show that a human embryo or fetus is a human being, a human organism. And since what we are human organisms, bodily beings, it follows that she is the same kind of being as you or me, only at an earlier stage of her life cycle. Just as you and I once were adolescents, and before that children, and before that infants, so we once were fetuses, and we once were embryos. Moreover, since what makes you and me intrinsically valuable as subjects of rights is what we are, our fundamental nature, it is wrong intentionally to kill us, and it would have been wrong to kill us when we were embryos or fetuses. All human beings, unborn as well as born, no matter at what age or size, are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with fundamental, unalienable rights. Therefore, it is gravely unjust to provide protection of the law to born human beings, but to deny it to unborn human beings. Since what is killed in abortion is a human being, the further act of governmentally funding and endorsing abortion providers is an additional injustice. By subsidizing abortion providers, the government, unlike the court in Roe v. Wade, cannot even make pretense of being neutral on the question of whether what is killed in abortion is a human being. To subsidize and encourage the killing of human fetuses is to presuppose in that act that what is killed in abortion is not a human being. Furthermore, the donation of organs after death requires prior authoritative consent in general, requires authoritative consent from the person who dies, or if a minor, from her parent. In the case of fetal organs or tissues, parental consent would be required. This seems permissible in the case of spontaneous miscarriages or ectopic pregnancies. However, that is not the case with relying on the consent of the parent of an elective abortion. Parental authority over children is based on the special connection of parents to their children, a connection that creates a special responsibility of parents to their children, a responsibility to care for them and to be devoted to their well-being. Grave abuses of that relationship or actions indicating that a parent no longer has the child's interest at heart cause the parent to lose that parental authority. But the choice to have the child killed, even if done in confusion and with mitigated responsibility, is incompatible with a willingness to act in the true interest of the child. Thus, the practice of allowing or encouraging the use of fetal tissue obtained from elective abortions, relying as it does on the mother's consent, treats the bodily parts of the fetus as if they were parts of the woman's body. The practice makes no sense unless the fetus is assumed to be something other than a human being. Therefore, governmental funding of abortion providers and the use of fetal tissue from elective abortions involve profound dehumanization of unborn human beings and are grave injustices. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Dr. Shamanda, you're recognized. 8 minutes.
Distinguished Chair Blackburn. Distinguished Chair Blackburn and honored members of the panel, thank you for the opportunity to offer my testimony in defense of infant lives, and specifically in opposition to research using fetal tissue derived from induced abortions. As background, I was trained in the disciplines of engineering and medicine, receiving a PhD in the medical engineering jointly awarded by Harvard University and Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I am currently a professor of radiology and biophysics, serving as vice chair of radiology research at the Medical College of Wisconsin. I have participated in medical research for nearly 25 years. I have served on grant review panels for the National Institutes of Health for nearly 15 years, including a 4-year term on the Developmental Therapeutics Study section. I serve on national advisory committees for clinical trials and have founded 2 startup companies. Most importantly, I'm a wife and a mother. The views expressed are my own and do not represent the official views of the Medical College of Wisconsin. I am firmly opposed to research using fetal or embryonic tissue from induced abortions or procedures such as in vitro fertilization. I am compelled to create awareness amongst the community and my colleagues as to why the use of such tissue is both unethical and unnecessary. Let me begin by defining terms. The terms embryo, fetus, baby, or infant each refer to different stages in the continuum of the developing child. When cells are extracted during the earliest stages, these are typically human embryonic stem cells, which are obtained by destruction of the human embryo. When I speak of fetal tissue research, I am referring to cells, tissues, or organs that are harvested from an aborted fetus. While this is the focus of my testimony, my arguments apply to the continuum of the developing child. Proponents of research using fetal tissue make several claims. The first claim is that without fetal tissue, many of the life-saving treatments we have today would not have been possible. Second, it is argued that without continued access to fetal tissue, we are preventing the discovery of new therapies. And third, it is alleged that proper ethical guidelines are already in place to avoid the connection between abortion and fetal tissue research. I will speak to each of these claims. First, it needs to be made clear that there are no current medical treatments today that have required use of fetal tissues for their discovery or development. While the often cited polio vaccine was developed using fetal tissue cells, The developers later testified that initial studies were also successful using cells that were not of fetal origin. Though most vaccines today offer ethical alternatives, not all are available in the U.S., and some, such as chickenpox and hepatitis A, currently do not have ethical alternatives. Yet let me make it clear, there have never been a scientific reason requiring fetal cell lines for vaccine development. Testimony given to the FDA dated May 16, 2001 underscores this point. The developer of two common fetal cell lines, HEC-293, human embryonic kidney, and PER-C6, isolated retina from a fetus, stated that his motivation for developing these cell lines from aborted fetuses was simply to see if it could be done, in comparison to what had already been done with animal cells. Since then, use of these cell lines has become widespread, and the manufacturers have no motivation to invest the time or money necessary to produce ethical replacements. Due to lack of transparency, scientists can unknowingly become entrenched in using these cell lines. For example, the HEC-293 cell line is often offered as part of a standard kit available from biotechnology companies and branded under various names. Only upon specific request are alternatives provided. This lack of transparency is devastating for scientists who have ethical objections to use of this tissue and amounts to moral coercion. Second, I refute the claim that without continued access to fetal tissue, the discovery of new therapies will be prevented. The evidence is overwhelming to the contrary. For example, insulin for diabetes is produced in bacteria. Chinese hamster ovary cells have been used for the development of Herceptin for breast cancer and TPA for heart attack and stroke. There are more than 70 successful treatments developed using adult stem cell sources. Over 1 million bone marrow transplants, which are essentially adult stem cell transplants, have been performed to date. Still, some continue to claim that fetal cells unequivocally provide the best option because they divide rapidly, adapt to new environments easily. But alternative tissue and cell sources are available for research without ethical concerns and are demonstrating more versatility than originally thought. Examples include stem cells from bone marrow, circulating blood, umbilical cord, and amniotic fluid, as well as induced pluripotent stem cells, and even neural stem cells from cadavers. Adult stem cells have already been used for the development of new treatments, have been proven in clinical trials, and resulted in the formation of new companies, which have successfully brought to market treatments that are routinely benefiting patients today. There is still no viable medical use for embryonic stem cells. Yet the argument continues that keeping this avenue of research open may someday offer the only hope for a child with a devastating disease or a person with spinal cord injury. In 1997, in the New York Times, it was reported that the nation's first transplant of fetal tissue into a person with spinal cord injury. The study required 5 to 8 fetal spinal cords for each adult recipient, but showed no significant therapeutic benefit. Many more studies followed, with none showing significant therapeutic benefit, yet with each continuing to claim great promise. The promise without benefit continues today at the cost of many human lives. So let me address this claim from another perspective. Consider the possibility that a treatment is discovered using fetal tissue transplants, and it is the only option for a certain disease. Consider just one disease like Parkinson's, which affects up to 1 million people in the US alone. Based on a clinical trial in Sweden, cells from at least 3 to 4 fetuses are needed to treat each Parkinson's patient. So 4 million babies would need to be aborted to treat this one disease, not to mention the number needed to treat patients worldwide. Imagine the magnitude of the demand for fetuses to cure yet another disease like Alzheimer's, which affects 44 million people worldwide. Do we really want a world where the most vulnerable, those with no voice, are subject to the whims, desired, and perceived needs of others? Clearly, we will have created industrialized harvesting of preborn babies, a crime against the human race. Third, the repeated assurances that proper ethical guidelines are in place to avoid the connection between abortion and subsequent research are entirely inadequate. By purchasing fetal tissue products, the researcher is not far removed from the act of abortion. As recently described in the journal Nature, one researcher continues to pay $830 for each fetal liver sample, a purchase he must repeatedly make. A few years ago, before the recent media coverage, it was quite easy to go to the website of a biotechnology company and put almost any fetal body part in one's shopping cart and submit for a purchase. So independent of whether a researcher is at the bedside of the one choosing an abortion or using a fetal cell line created decades prior, by purchasing these fetal tissue products, scientists are helping to create a market that drives the abortion biotechnology
Dr. Shamanda,
industry
please
complex.
wrap up. Your time has expired.
So finally, I conclude with what is first and foremost. Each and every human life is sacred, with a fundamental dignity that does not depend on his or her developmental stage or abilities. This value belongs to all without distinction from the first moment of existence. Each and every human life is unique and unrepeatable, created by our loving God in his image and likeness. Nothing, no person, no argument, not even a scientific discovery or cure can diminish the fact that using human embryos or fetuses as objects or means of experimentation constitutes an assault against the dignity of human beings who have a right to the same respect owed to every person. Thank you.
I thank you. And Dr. Goldstein, you're recognized for 8 minutes for an opening statement.
Good morning, actually good afternoon, Chairwoman Blackburn, Ranking Member Schakowsky, and other members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you this afternoon about the important and potentially life-saving research being done with fetal cells and fetal tissue. And I'll give you 3 brief examples for the potential impact of this work. My bio is in your written materials. I'll just summarize a few key points. My early faculty career was spent at Harvard University, where I became a tenured professor. I then moved to the University of California, San Diego in 1993, and I'm currently a distinguished professor in the Department of Cellular and Molecular Medicine and the Department of Neuroscience there. I serve as director of the UC San Diego Stem Cell Program, scientific director of the Sanford Consortium for Regenerative Medicine, and director of the Sanford Stem Cell Clinical Center. I've received numerous honors and awards for my work. I've been a practicing scientist for 40 years, most recently using all types of stem cells to understand and treat Alzheimer's disease, spinal cord injury, ALS, and more recently, kidney disease. Today, I represent myself and the International Society for Stem Cell Research, the American Society for Cell Biology, and the Coalition for Life Sciences, which together represent in excess of 60,000 practicing life scientists and physicians. My message is very simple. Fetal tissue and cells that would otherwise be discarded play a vital role in modern, cutting-edge biomedical research. These fetal tissues and cells cannot be easily replaced by embryonic stem cells, reprogrammed stem cells, or adult stem cells. Let me give you 3 examples. In the first example, we are using fetal astrocytes in the study of Alzheimer's disease. This devastating disease affects 5.3 million Americans and costs us in excess of $200 to $300 billion a year. It killed my own mother. This number doesn't reflect the real and terrible hardship that families face. We don't have a cure. No cure is obviously in sight, and we really do have to find a way to treat this terrible disorder. Now, in my own lab, the approach we're taking is to use reprogrammed stem cells to make Alzheimer's type brain cells in the dish. That is, to generate Alzheimer's disease in a dish and to try to understand what's going wrong and to develop drugs that curtail the problems that happen biochemically. Now, a type of cell that's very valuable in this work is called an astrocyte. And this is a type of cell that is a support cell in the brain. We use fetal astrocytes, which are vital to these investigations. These fetal astrocytes provide growth factors that keep the nerve cells healthy, that help them establish connections, And to be honest, they produce factors that we do not yet have fully defined that help maintain the viability of these cultures and are proving important to us to make new discoveries. It is possible to make astrocytes from stem cells, and you can write the label astrocytes on those stem cells, but they are not identical in their behavior and properties to fetal astrocytes, which arguably remain the gold standard to which we compare astrocytes made from stem cells, and we cannot yet use astrocytes made from stem cells to replace fetal astrocytes. These astrocytes are vital to our investigations, and I remain hopeful that they will help us conquer the scourge of this terrible disease. In a second example, in the center that I direct, the Sanford Stem Cell Clinical Center, we're using fetal neural stem cells in clinical trials for spinal cord injury in human patients. In animal versions of spinal cord injury, these fetal neural stem cells have previously been shown to have really remarkable properties, and animals so treated exhibit tremendously greater performance after treatment than before. What seems to happen is that these fetal neural stem cells, when implanted at the site of the injury, make new neurons that form a relay across the site of the injury, enabling these animals to regain function. Now, as a result of the work in animals, we have FDA approval to test these fetal stem cells in human patients. Physicians and surgeons in my center have initiated an FDA-approved phase 1 clinical trials of these cells and have implanted them in 4 patients within the past year. I'll tell you that these surgeries are very arduous, and the human volunteers are courageous in the face of uncertainty about their future. Thus far, the trial's a success. We've learned that at minimum, the surgery is safe, the fetal cells are safe, and we will be tracking these patients over the next few years looking for signs of recovery as these cells are given the opportunity to develop and positively impact the paralysis. We hope in the next year to begin transplanting patients with cervical spinal cord injuries, which will give us a more sensitive test bed, we think. This trial and others like it, this is not the only such trial. Others are pursuing analogous investigations with different sorts of cells, but these trials are vital to pushing medical science forward and to helping to rescue people who are afflicted with spinal cord injuries, which is a terrible affliction. I'll just mention that these same fetal neural stem cells that we're using for spinal cord injury are also being used in phase 1 and soon to be phase 2 clinical investigations for ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease, at NIH-sponsored centers around the country. In a third and final example, I chair the executive committee of a group of NIH-funded scientists who are trying to learn whether it is possible to build new kidneys from stem cells. This goal is significant because we have 93,000 Americans on waiting lists for kidney transplants, and we recognize that the goal of building a functional kidney is audacious, but audacious goals build audacious dreams and projects and progress. And I believe that we can attain these goals with hard work, determination, and time. It won't happen instantly, but it's something I think we can achieve. Fetal tissue that would otherwise be discarded is vital to the future of this investigation, as it's only by examining fetal tissue that we're able to deduce and learn what the signals are that cells use to tell each other which cells are going to become kidney, which are going to become other parts of the body, and so on. So our ability to examine the very earliest stages of human development are ultimately vital to our understanding and our ability to treat many diseases in the future, including diseases of pregnancy, diseases of the placenta, and diseases of children and adults. Development of many of these therapies depend upon our learning what the normal signals are by studying the earliest stages of development. And without this type of research, we will be dramatically slowed down, and people who would have therapies sooner will wait and suffer needlessly longer. So let me close by stating once again that in my opinion, research with fetal tissue and cells that would otherwise be discarded is ethical, valuable, and vital to ongoing biomedical research projects. I want to thank the committee for your time, and I'm prepared to answer questions that you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Goldstein. We will move to questions, and on our side, I'm going to reserve my time, and Joe Pitts, Chairman Pitts, will be recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks again to the witnesses for coming today. Let me just say something for the record that wasn't covered in the last panel. The issue of undercover journalism was raised, but I just want to put this quote on the record. The indictment was alarming enough for 2 pro-abortion scholars at Cornell to write an opinion piece defending undercover journalism. Professors Sherry Kolb and Michael Dorff said, quote, "We are pro-choice and we support the important work of Planned Parenthood, but we find the prosecution of these citizen journalists, however self-styled, deeply disturbing. Undercover exposés play a vital role in informing the American public of important facts that would otherwise remain hidden." End quote. We're all familiar with local TV station I-teams and undercover exposés using hidden cameras, sometimes false narratives. Mike Wallace was famous. Journalists have gone undercover to expose shoddy conditions at the VA hospitals. Nick Kristof of New York Times posed as a customer to reveal the darkness of sex trafficking in Cambodia, and you could go on and on. So for the record, I'll put that. Now, let me go to this question. The gentleman mentioned Harvard. I think using whether fresh fetal tissue is vital to cures is an open question. Presently, Harvard has 8,000 medical research projects underway. Only 10 use fresh fetal tissues. 10 out of 8,000. Now, some defend the practice of fetal tissue collection from aborted babies because the fetal tissue supposedly contributes to life-saving research today. First, can you tell us what deadly disease have been cured or can now be treated thanks to modern-day collection of human fetal body parts? Anyone? No. And
I think
secondly, I'm sorry?
I would like to respond because
Yeah,
I think the case of vaccines is appropriate. The fact is that's how those vaccines were developed.
Which vaccines?
Polio and the other long list that Professor Charo gave us. And it's so easy to look in the rearview mirror at research and say, well, now that we know everything we know, it would have been so much easier to do it a different way. You didn't have to do it this way. But the fact is, as you well know, research is a slow, tough enterprise.
Yeah, reclaiming my time. The simple fact that the vaccine for polio was developed using monkey tissue, not human fetal tissue. Let me go on to my question, and it has to do with conflict of interest. Suppose a tissue procurement business makes financial contributions to an abortion clinic from which the company harvests tissue. What ethical issues exist if the clinic notifies the company in advance that the clinic has particular abortions scheduled that would be good for acquiring particular organs or tissue? Dr. Lee.
Can you help me? It was the, who's making the contribution to whom again?
The procurement business.
Is making the contribution to the abortion clinic?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think there's a conflict of interest in that there's not the separation. I think that there's in all of these organ transplant cases, we want to have a different set of team making the decisions about how to proceed, how to treat a patient, and then a different set of team from that on talking to the family about whether to make a donation. And if it's, it seems to me it's the same team here that's working on aborting this baby, that is also trying to get the consent from the woman, which I think is questionable whether it has authoritative authority there, but getting consent for that woman to use the fetal body parts. So I think there's a conflict of interest there, yes.
Dr. Shamanda?
Yes, there's definitely a conflict of interest, and I'd like to also add, with regard to the procurement of tissue, I oversee a tissue bank for brain tumor tissue and spinal cord tumor tissue. And our procedure is such that we have to have someone constantly on call with a pager, and they have to be there in the OR, ready to go 30 minutes from tissue removal. And if you don't get that tissue within 30 minutes of removal, it's no longer useful for research, especially the more advanced research like genomics and proteomics. So it's very difficult to see how there can be a separation between the research and the requirements of the scientific community and the act of procuring that tissue.
My time's expired. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Schakowsky, you're recognized for 5 minutes for question.
Thank you. Ms. Shamanda, you oppose the use of fetal tissue in scientific research, right? Is this the position your university has?
I represent my own views. I'm not representing my university.
In fact, last September, Dr. John Raymond, the president and CEO of your university, testified in opposition to a Wisconsin State Senate bill that would prohibit researchers in the state from using fetal tissue in their research. Dr. Goldstein, my colleagues have used documents, emails from researchers seeking fetal tissue, and I don't know, maybe it's in an effort to shock us, but what is your feeling about, asking for example, it may not sound great, but a liver, thymus, that kind of thing, if you have specific research going on. Do you see anything unethical about that?
Absolutely.
No, I'm asking Dr.
excuse me.
Goldstein that.
No, I don't see anything unethical about asking for specific regions. When we get brain tissue from our Alzheimer's disease brain bank, we will request the hippocampus or a part of the cortex or a specific part of the brain as part of the normal procedure for obtaining postmortem tissue.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask you, there's been concerns about recent outbreak of Zika, of course, and it's led to renewed focus on infectious diseases that have the potential to rapidly spread. As you know, there seems to be a strong link between Zika virus infection during pregnancy and the congenital microcephaly, a devastating birth defect. And at this point, there's no treatment or vaccine for Zika. Given the majority's insistence on calling this panel the Select Investigative Panel on Infant Lives, it would seem important to focus on potential ways to improve infant lives, like finding a way to prevent or cure Zika, the Zika virus, and the potential for microcephaly. In fact, the CDC has recently released guidance on the collection and submission of fetal tissue for Zika virus testing. They recognize that the study of this tissue is the means through which we can understand the virus. So, Dr. Goldstein, how are we expected to learn and understand the implications of the Zika virus without studying the fetal tissue?
I think that if you want to understand the Zika virus, the most efficient place to start is with the fetal tissue that is infected. That just seems self-evident to me.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it imperative that researchers have access to brain tissue to study the differences between the healthy neurological cells and those potentially infected with microcephaly?
Well, and in particular for figuring out which cell types are infected. It's often forgotten that the brain is made of dozens, if not more, kinds of cells. We don't know which cell type is being infected by the virus, and it's only by surveying the landscape that we'll get any clues.
The World Health Organization has now labeled the Zika virus as public health emergency of international concern. What is your view of preventing the use of fetal tissue research to study and hopefully stop this growing public health emergency?
I think that would be sticking your head in the sand.
Thank you. Would not having fetal tissue as a resource in this study potentially delay finding a cure?
It would absolutely delay it. I think you have to go to the source if you want to understand what's going wrong.
Going back to the name of this committee, this type of research could lead to treatments and cures that benefit infant lives, could it not?
That would be the hope. There's never any guarantee with research that we're going to get to where we want to go. But we're going to give it a good solid try, and we have to have appropriate tools.
This type of, beyond Zika virus, fetal tissue is important for research into other conditions that impact infant and fetal development. Is that correct? And I'm wondering if you could name what else we might be investigating.
Well, another interest in my lab is in a disorder called Niemann-Pick type C1, which is a devastating cholesterol transport disorder that kills kids in their first or second year of life. We use fetal astrocytes in our investigation of that disorder as well. We've recently discovered what I hope will be 2 drugs that may be effective. We need to get into clinical trials to find out, but it's the sort of thing that you could imagine doing on multiple occasions down the line. You know, again, research is not a guarantee, but we have to go through the door and look in order to find out.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Ms. Black, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank the panelists for being here. I think it is really ironic that we sit here and talk about how we will benefit children, and at the same time, we're talking about how it's okay to abort a baby and, excuse me, and to dissect it and take out its body parts and use that for research. But at the same time, we talk about how this will save babies. So it's very ironic. Do we want to save babies or do we not want to save babies? But that's not my question. My question, I want to go to our babies that are born alive in these abortion clinics. And just last week, there was a 20-week-old child that was born alive in a Phoenix abortion clinic. There was a fire department that was close and had to transport the baby to the hospital. Since sometimes these children are born alive, either during or right after the abortion, should abortion clinics have neonatal care equipment in those clinics to help to save those babies? Dr. Lee, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if we were treating someone that we really genuinely recognize as a human being and as having intrinsic dignity, we would say that we need to have available the kind of care that is needed if something goes wrong. And we would not fight every inch of the way when the government, whether it's state or federal level, tries to require protection for babies who are born alive. So yes, I think yes, neonatal care, access to ambulance care. I think that is a minimum, I think.
Dr. Shamanda, do you have a thought on that?
I can't imagine it, because when you have the neonatal care unit, you're recognizing that this is a human person. And I think absolutely it must be, because it is a human person. It would be wonderful if it existed, but.
How about you, Dr. Goldstein? You have a thought on that?
I am not an expert on the sort of equipment that should be present in an abortion clinic, and it would be inappropriate for me to speculate.
Well, can I ask you, do you think it's wrong to let a child die that is born in a abortion clinic and needs medical assistance?
I think it is wrong to let a child die.
Thank you. The second question that I have along these lines, should the mother be told as a part of that consent form that there's a chance that your baby will be born alive and that our clinic will give your baby the best care? Ethically, what do you think about that, Dr. Lee?
Well, I think it's hard to say when you're talking about percentages, and it's a difficult question to answer because the premise of it is that we're talking about asking someone full consent for something that I think if they genuinely understood and had and had a moral outlook, a just outlook, they would not really want to consent to that. So it's kind of I find it difficult to answer that question, but I would say that I think in general there is not enough consent, enough information given to the woman about the nature of what it is that's being killed in an abortion. Sometimes it's even hidden from her that anything's being killed, that there was even something alive. So if we could just get even just general, really good informed consent about the nature of that procedure is that we're talking about, that would be a first step. And then yes, I think the other things should be brought in when you're talking about the the possibilities. Even if it's a remote possibility, it's such a horrific possibility. And it also, I think, bears on the question that she should be asking about, well, what kind of thing, what kind of procedure is this?
Thank you. With a little bit of time that I have left, Madam Chairman, I'm not so sure after we complete our investigations and our information that we'll receive as a result of this committee, that there shouldn't be another Blue Ribbon Commission. We talk about this Blue Ribbon Commission that was under President Reagan, was done back in 1984. We're 30 years down the road. There's so much medical science advancement here. At that point in time, the viability, I was still young out of nursing school, the viability was around 36 weeks. And, you know, if we had a baby that was born at 36 weeks or less, we really didn't have a lot of medical advancements for saving that child. But I think that this whole issue really needs to be revisited, and rather than going back and looking at a Blue Ribbon Commission that was done some 30 years ago, that may be one of the recommendations that we have, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Ms. DeGette, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As with the last panel, I would appreciate yes and no answers if possible. My first question, Dr. Lee, you're a doctor of philosophy, correct? Right. And Dr. Shamanda, you have a PhD in medical engineering, correct?
Correct.
And the first line of your biography on the Medical College of Wisconsin's website says your primary focus of your lab is the development of MRI methods to assess brain tumors. Is that correct?
That's definitely a focus, yes.
Now, Dr. Goldstein, you're an actual cell-based researcher and you run a lab. Is that correct?
Yes.
So I'm going to talk to you, since of all the 6 witnesses we've had today, you seem to be the only one with experience in being able to talk about fetal tissue research and other types of cell-based research. First question I want to ask you is, Dr. Donovan said we still have fetal cell lines developed from fetal tissue from abortions from before and from a long time ago when they were used for vaccines and other purposes. Those should still be sufficient. Do you believe that existing fetal cell lines are sufficient?
If you don't mind, there's been a lot of discussion of the 1988 advisory panel, this blue ribbon panel that people have been discussing. And I want to clarify, because in my reading of this panel, there was actually 21 panel members, and of the 21, there was 2 or 3 that dissented from the majority opinion. Now, the majority opinion itself basically was that we agree that there is a moral question here.
Okay, I'm gonna have to move on because
Okay.
I'm running out of time. Dr. Lee, you have any comments on that question about, I mean, it's just like, I mean, it makes no sense to me that if there's no money in this,
merit, it would prove too much. It would prove that, well, then, since it's going to be discarded anyway, we might as well allow people to make money off this. Or in any situation where someone dies who did not consent to have his body used for research, the same argument could be made about that person's body and say, well, look, that person did not, yes, true, that person did not give consent.
understood. My
but
time has
it's
expired.
yeah.
Thank you very much.
I thank the gentleman. Ms. Spear, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you all. Dr. Lee, again, you're not a researcher, correct?
No, not in physical science, right?
Not in physical science. And yet this hearing is about the use of fetal tissue
Right,
in a scientific setting. So
my area of study is bioethics.
it's a little confusing to me as to why this panel, which should be comprised of scientists, doesn't have a whole panel of scientists. But you are an ethicist, so let me ask you this. One of the questions one of my colleagues asked was, is it unethical for a tissue procurement facility to contribute to an abortion clinic? And you gave an answer. Do you think it's ethical for members of Congress to receive campaign contributions and then vote for a specific bill from that institution or carry a bill for that institution?
I'd have to get more specifics by meaning a bill for that institution. I don't know if it's a bill. Yeah, I guess if you're saying if the bill is precisely not for the public good but for only this specific institution, yeah, that would be unethical. But then of course that just raises the question of whether we're talking about the public good or whether we are trying to promote a specific institution.
Well,
and I think that.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments.
So,
It
yes.
just is kind of preposterous for us to sit up on this committee and suggest about ethical behavior when we are in the business of campaigning and raising money from individuals who are interested in getting us to vote one way or another. Let me ask you, Dr. Goldstein, 41 academic institutions have written a letter emphasizing the need for continued fetal tissue research. In your own words, can you explain what's at stake if this research is not permitted to continue?
Predicting the future is a very dodgy business, and any of us who claim to predict the future have got to do so cautiously. But I think it's fair to say research into deadly disease will slow down. And that's not virtual. If I'm 2 years later finding a therapy for a disorder, that's 2 years worth of people who will have developed that disorder and passed away from it. I think back to Christopher Reeve, with whom I testified some years ago in an embryonic stem cell hearing. And we talked at that time about what was at stake for people like Mr. Reeve. And the fact was, time was at stake. So he sadly did not live long enough to see us putting an appropriate fetal neural stem cell type into clinical trial. I'm sorry about that, because I think he would have been really heartened to see that. And he ran out of time.
I was very impressed by your work with spinal cord injuries. There's many people who are paralyzed, whose life, the quality of life is diminished greatly. the work you're doing right now where you're using fetal neural stem cells has the potential, does it not, to create a means by which individuals in the future who are living in a paralyzed state could in fact have fuller function?
That's the potential if everything goes according to plan.
There was a reference made earlier about of cosmetic purposes that fetal tissue could be used for. It was interesting that my colleague didn't reference the word reconstructive and cosmetic purposes. And I think we fail to appreciate that skin grafts are used in very important reconstructive purposes. Persons who are burn victims benefit by the use of skin grafts. I personally have a body that is full of skin grafts due to an injury I received over 36 years ago. So let's not diminish or somehow dilute the importance of the use of skin grafts in the effort to potentially improve people's lives. I'm also concerned, and I've only got 20 seconds left, so Dr. Goldstein, I'm concerned about the chilling effect on researchers who are now being called, much like the McCarthy hearings of old, to have their names associated with research they're doing. Could you speak to that?
I think a chilling effect of naming names is always a danger of this sort of proceeding.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Dr. Harris is recognized for 5
Thank
minutes.
you very much. Dr. Shamanda, let me just clarify, because I think a question was asked you before, do you oppose fetal tissue research? But your summary says that you believe that we should prohibit research using fetal tissue from induced abortion. Is that the correct summary?
Correct.
Okay, because we're frequently, we're painting with a broad brush that, somehow we all oppose fetal, this life-saving fetal tissue. We're talking specifically
Yes.
about induced abortions.
Absolutely.
So you have done medical research for 25 years, and although your qualification has been questioned to sit on this panel, since this panel is bioethical issues, I take it you have filled out IRB consents before?
Yes, all the time.
Okay. And the purpose is to ethically protect patients, right?
Correct.
So I'm going to ask Exhibit A3 to be put up again, which is the donation form that we ask, that comes from a clinic where this fetal tissue is obtained. And I will tell you that and I'm sure when you have obtained consent for research, you are careful not to overpromise, because that, of course, would induce a patient to accept or consent to research. So I'm going to read the first line. It says from this, research using the blood from pregnant women and tissue that has been aborted has been used to treat and find a cure for diseases as diabetes, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, cancer, and AIDS. And I'm going to ask Dr. Goldstein in a second, we really have found a cure using fetal tissue for diabetes, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, cancer, and AIDS? Because that's exactly what this form says. And if I had made this promise to a patient I was obtaining consent for, my IRB would never allow me to say that what we're doing has found a cure. Is that what your IRBs would do?
Absolutely. Yes,
That's what I thought. Let me just keep going, because I have limited time, and I do want to ask Dr. Goldstein a few questions, because I personally am not, Dr. Goldstein, look, thank you for your willingness over 40 years to look into these diseases that affect human beings. No question about it. I was medical research, you're medical. Again, I'm not going to relitigate use of fetal tissue, because I think we have a broad agreement that fetal tissue ethically obtained is absolutely appropriate. First of all, you have suggested that anything that slows this process down is a bad thing. You kind of suggested that. You have an IRB. How long does it take your IRB to approve normally? Mine took months. Oh, I know exactly why you're left. It can take months or even a year, can't it?
That's right. And,
okay.
And
so
if I might chip in
no,
here.
No, you can't. I've got to keep going, because I have a bunch of questions, and I appreciate that. You're totally honest about that. So we have already made the decision it's all right to slow down life-saving research when it involves humans for ethical reasons, because we have a national policy that you have to have an IRB, which we know slows down life-saving research. So the question is not whether it's all right to slow it down. It's whether it's ethical, to assure ethics. In an article in Nature magazine in December, I'm sure you know you've said this, regarding aborted fetus, you says, quote, "We are not happy about how the material became available, but we would not be willing to see it wasted and just thrown away." And I'm just going to concentrate on the quote, "We're not happy about how the material became available." Why? Why are you not happy about how that material became available? Is that an accurate quote? I mean, and believe me, I know sometimes the press misquotes us.
It's an absolutely accurate quote, and I think probably the best way to think about it is I don't seek out controversy.
Okay.
I'd be happier if my research just happened in a quiet back room and I could get on with the business of looking for therapies.
And that's every researcher I've known in medicine has felt the same way, so I absolutely understand that opinion. I've got to tell you, and again, you've been brutally honest with us, and I thank you for your honesty. It's been suggested that it's immoral for these tissues to be discarded. Literally, I mean, we can replay the transcript, that it's immoral. Do you agree that if one of these patients doesn't sign this form and that the tissue is discarded, that woman is making an immoral decision?
May I answer?
Absolutely.
It is up to the patient to make that decision.
But is it immoral if the woman chooses not to make the donation?
No, it is not immoral.
Thank you very, very much for that honesty. And I'm just going to ask Dr. Lee, because you're a bioethicist, is that form ethical, where you tell a patient that diabetes, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, cancer, and AIDS, that this tissue has been used to find a cure? Past tense, it's not we're going to use it to attempt to find a cure. It's been used to find a cure. English has a very specific meaning. Is that unethical to ask this woman at a time when she's making a difficult decision to say that this tissue has been used to cure diseases when it hasn't?
No, in order to make a fully informed consent, you have to be given accurate information.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Delbene, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think everyone agrees that medical research using human tissue should adhere to ethical standards. There's no disagreement. But as Dr. Goldstein and every researcher in America knows, that's true for all human tissue. If I wanted to donate tissue as part of a research study, the use of my tissue would be overseen by an institutional review board and subject to strict ethical and legal rules. I'm an organ donor. I assume many people in this room are organ donors. And if an accident took place and any of us were in a position where our organs would be donated, the use of our organs to save someone else's life would rightfully be subject to similar ethical guidelines. Rules guiding scientific research should be crafted in a reasonable and deliberate manner, and they should be crafted by science, not by ideology. As Professor Charo pointed out, diseases also do not discriminate. The majority's attacks on research are an attack on all Americans' health, because nearly everyone in this country has benefited from research involving fetal tissue. Dr. Goldstein, as you know, medical breakthroughs come after years of incremental progress, often starting with very basic research that was conducted sometimes for an entirely different purpose, and we learned something that was very relevant to move forward in a different area. Our greatest discoveries might have gone undiscovered if we'd cut off avenues of basic research that didn't seem promising at the time. So how would you respond to claims that this research isn't useful or necessary anymore?
Well, I don't disagree that it's not useful or not necessary any longer. And the fact is, as you correctly recognize, of 100 times that we start testing a therapy, 90 or 95% of the time it's a dry well. We fail more often than we succeed, but we persist. What we learn from the failures is important to help us figure out how to be successful in the future.
So clarify, you do think that it's useful and necessary to continue this type of research?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
If Republicans were successful in cutting off this research, would potential for medical breakthroughs be slowed or stopped altogether?
It would be slowed.
And could you speak about some of the work that's going on right now, the ongoing research in this area?
Well, I mean, if our clinical trials with fetal neural stem cells and spinal cord injury were halted, I think that would be a terrible shame, because I think it's one of our most promising avenues. It's not just us that have seen these properties with these cells. It's been repeated in other labs. It looks like a very good, fertile ground, and I would hate to see it stalled. Same
And
for our work
do you
on
think there would
Alzheimer's.
be ethical implications to not continuing that type of research?
You know, we owe it to our descendants what kind of world we give them. And I know that can be taken in a variety of different ways. But we are following the law. We are doing work that has been deemed ethical by the mainstream scientific community. And it is work that looks as though it's going to be very promising. I wonder if I might give you one comment. You know, in Parkinson's disease, fetal tissue research is sometimes pointed to as having not been successful because it didn't yield in and of itself a cure. The fact is that fetal tissue research has taught us what now to do with embryonic stem cells and perhaps with reprogrammed stem cells. So even in that case, we learned a lot about how not to do things, how to avoid overdosing tissue, what types of cells to make in the future.
I agree. I did medical research when I started my career, and sometimes the things that didn't go as you anticipated actually yield the greatest learning.
Yeah.
Folks brought up earlier that there has been a series of subpoenas and sweeping overbroad document requests demanding names of patients, doctors, medical students, all who are involved in women's health care and vital medical research without really any legitimate reason for doing so. I wondered if you believe that that kind of environment is conducive to academic freedom and scientific advancement.
No, I think it's terrible when researchers have to worry about their personal safety.
And do you think the political climate can have a chilling effect on scientific research going forward if that continues?
It's already having it.
It's already having it. In what way are you seeing that today?
So, so there's another project that I'm involved with that has basically seen supply of fetal material dry up completely. And it was a very promising therapy for MS.
Thank you. My time's expired. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank the gentlelady, Ms. Hartzler, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I just want to clarify that we don't have issues with studying the babies who are stillborn or miscarried due to the microcephaly or Zika. And that is happening, but it's another thing entirely to have parents abort and use the aborted babies for research. So, Ms. Shamanda, can information about microcephaly associated with Zika be obtained using fetal tissue from affected babies that are miscarried or stillborn?
Yes, absolutely. And I think when we speak of abortions, induced abortions, and the tissue we get from them as a reference or as a gold standard, that's completely incorrect because the genetic identity of these children are not known.
Very good. I'd like to carry on some more questions with you. Could you describe in detail how the tissue procurement process takes place? What personnel and equipment are involved?
Absolutely. So as I had mentioned briefly before, we actually have a full-time person that oversees a tissue bank. And they're on call with a pager so they know when the tissue is going to be removed at the time of surgery. So they have to be there within 30 minutes carrying with them a liquid nitrogen dewar because the tissue has to be flash frozen in order to maintain the quality of the research tissue. Otherwise, a lot of the analysis, the advanced analysis like genetic and proteomic analysis, could not be performed with any reliability.
Are you familiar with how fetal tissue is procured, though, and the process involved with that?
I am not, but I can't imagine it's any different.
If we could put up Exhibit A2, this is the exact compensation chart for a procurement technician. And I think America needs to be aware of this process. They are paid $10 per hour plus a per tissue or blood bonus, as outlined in the table below. The tissue is divided up into categories A, B, and C. 1 to 10 specimens, for instance, of category A is $35 a tissue, and it goes up from there, $45, $55, $65, $75 a tissue. So there is a financial incentive for them to take this money, or to take this tissue, and they're getting paid for that. And yet, if you could put up Exhibit A3, we have, once again, the consent form that's given to the woman who comes in to have an abortion under very, very stressful time in their life. We have already discussed how this form is clearly unethical because it makes promises to the woman saying that this is going to result in cures and has resulted in cures for AIDS, cancer, Alzheimer's, etc., which is totally false. So women are already being told inaccurate information in order to induce them. And then it also says, I understand I will not be paid. So my question is, how come the woman isn't paid for this?
That's a good question, because in all other, we look at coercion of the patient as a very, very severe, very strict guideline when you're putting the IRB together. So we can never promise that there's any benefit to the patient when they undergo an IRB-approved study. And so having this information about diseases that is untrue and not talking about what could happen as a possible risks is also completely irregular compared to
Didn't you in your testimony give an example of some money that was spent by a procurement company for a sample? I'm trying to find it. Do you remember it was?
Yes, $830 per fetal liver tissue sample.
So a woman is not giving any money for this. She is being coerced to sign this under duress with inaccurate information, and yet the procurement company is getting up to $830-some per liver, in addition to whatever else is in the sample. Could be, people are getting rich off of this, and yet the woman is getting nothing from it other than having an abortion. I think this is just it is just unconscionable that we would accept as America that this would continue on. When women are being taken advantage of and money is being made off of them at the expense of not only that woman, but her aborted baby. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Ms. Watson-Coleman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I wanted to ask Mr. Goldstein a couple of questions. Mr. Goldstein, you mentioned that some promising research with regard to MS was stopped or has been negatively impacted. Could you please elaborate a little bit on what you mean and what direction was it going into and why it has not yielded that?
It was getting close to the clinical trial stage, and then as a result of the political discussion and the threats to abortion providers, it is believed that they stopped being willing to provide tissue any longer.
Dr. Goldstein, have there been cures to any diseases resulting from the research emanating from fetal tissue? Have any cures been found?
I think we've gone back and forth on the vaccine issue a number of times, so I think we'll leave that one alone for the time being. I think I'm in the business of moving forward. I look for therapies for diseases where we don't yet have any. I'm not aware of any that have been definitely been solved using fetal tissue, although arguably the development of treatments for HIV depended a great deal on being able to develop humanized mice that had a human immune system in animals. And I think that was initiated using fetal blood-forming stem cells.
Do you believe that anything on that form is creating an undue hardship or an intimidation or a misrepresentation to women who are being asked to consider whether or not they will donate this tissue?
I'm sorry, which form, ma'am?
The form that my colleagues keep referring to that says that women who are under duress need to sign in order to give their consent.
So if it's the form that says therapies for diseases such as Alzheimer's disease and all the rest have already been found, I agree. That's an inappropriate statement and should not have been made on that form. I don't know who wrote it. That would not have made it past my IRB either.
It seems to me that this has been an interesting day where we've had empirical evidence as to the worthwhile use of fetal tissue research, that it has produced and is producing results moving us in the right direction to be cures and appropriate therapies and treatments for diseases and for injuries that otherwise negatively impact the life and the quality of life for individuals. It's also clear to me today that the question before us is just really nothing more than a proxy for getting at an attack on women's rights to what have already been established as a safe abortion in this country. And it just concerns me that we would have a panel of legislators sharing misinformation and sharing information that isn't documented in any way, shape, or form, indicating that people are making money off of women's bodies, and that there's something about people becoming rich by this, by engaging in fetal tissue research, and leaving that out there as if it is the truth when in fact we know it is not. Mr. Goldstein, Dr. Goldstein, I know that you don't generally handle that end of it, but to your knowledge, is there an industry that is getting rich and that is taking advantage of women's body parts as a result of fetal tissue research?
Not to my knowledge.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Ms. Love, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Dr. Lee, can you explain to me how organ donations are done at Georgetown Medical? What kind of codes of conduct must be followed in order to get consent for organ donation?
I'm not at Georgetown, but at Mercy Hospital in Pittsburgh, there's a consent form that's very detailed, and the donation team is separate from any of the doctors who treat the patient, and there has to be a fully informed consent there, and that complete separation. The doctors say, well, the team will come in and they want to talk to you, but they won't. The doctors who are treating the patient will not bring up with the family the same.
So is there any contact between the person giving consent, the recipient of the organ, the technician that is transferring the organ, or the physician that's procuring the organ during or before the forms are signed or consent is given?
There's not direct, there's contact between a team that mediates between the procurement.
So there's a mediator.
And that team is the one that speaks to the family members and patients, but there's always that go-between, that mediation.
Great. I want to focus again on trying to protect the minor. Is it possible, Dr. Shamanda, did I get that?
Shamanda.
Thank you. Is it possible for a minor to undergoing an abortion procedure to be faced with the decision to donate tissue on the same day that she's receiving that procedure?
That's unconscionable. No. At that age, no, that should never happen.
Does that happen?
I am not aware. I mean, I'm not in that industry. So no, I'm not aware of exactly the procedures followed.
Does anyone know if that actually on this panel, if that actually happens the day that the minor is receiving, or the day that anybody is receiving the procedure, that they are faced with donating the tissue on that very day?
I don't think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Except for abortion, I think it is.
Okay. So from what I understand, there are strict codes of conduct and guidelines for adult organ donations, but there are little to no laws or guidelines protecting minors when giving consent to perform an abortion or giving consent to have a child's tissue donated. Again, I'm coming at this looking at my 14-year-old and seeing what it was like for her to have an ACL surgery and how frightened she was. I couldn't imagine a 14-year-old going into a clinic without someone there that she trusts, that's an advocate for her, when she is faced with an organ, with donating tissue of an organ when she is going to be receiving these procedures herself. I couldn't imagine doing that myself, let alone a minor. I'm trying to ask, who is there to actually protect that minor when they're going in to have these procedures? Who is there on her side? The last thing I want to say is that there are times in our history in this country that we thought the behavior and the terrible treatment of some human beings were okay. Throughout our history, we had the opportunity to look back and say we were wrong. I am here because we've looked back at behavior that we thought was unethical and we changed it. Boy, I hope that we live in a country where we can look at the history and say the treatment of an unborn child is unethical. The treatment of a minor that is going in to receive some of these procedures should have someone on their side. And I hope that we live in a country where we can look back and we can change some of those things. I would not be here if we didn't have people making that courageous decision. I hope that we in this country are able to stand up and say the treatment is unethical. We're going to change it.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Nadler for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me first make an observation. Dr. Lee, in his written testimony, says, there is a serious problem concerning the woman's consent regarding the use of tissues and organs from the abortion procedure. How can her consent have ethical or legal significance given her previous choice to abort? We went through this in the first panel, too. He also said a little later, quote, anyone with a just moral outlook would not consent to an abortion. Anyone with a just moral outlook would not consent to an abortion. Now, that's his opinion. It's the opinion of a lot of people in this room, but it's not the opinion of a lot of other people. How can her consent have ethical or legal significance given her previous choice to abort? Maybe the choice to abort had more significant questions. Maybe the fetus had Down syndrome, for instance, and it's a less easy question. There are plenty of religious leaders in this country who disagree with your moral conclusion. This is a moral question, it's a moral choice, that is quite clearly debatable. It's not self-evident. It's clearly debatable since we've been debating it for the last 50 or 60 years without a conclusion. Even if individuals, such as two of our panelists and some others on this panel, may have moral opinions of which they are certain, other people have contrary opinions of which they are certain. So to say that because the woman, the mother, disagrees with your personal conclusion or the personal moral view of some church, therefore, you will take away, we should take away her moral right to make the choice on donation of fetal tissue is an assertion of absolute moral arrogance, which you have no right to make and we have no right to make. It's her decision, not ours and not yours, and it's her moral decision, not ours and not yours. Second, I'd like to ask Dr. Shamanda, I hope is the correct name?
Shamanda.
Dr. Shamanda, you said that the use of we've all agreed that the use of fetal tissue derived not from an abortion is moral, is ethical. The question is the use of fetal tissue derived from an abortion? And you said that the use of such tissue to cure, if it were possible, or perhaps when it's possible, to cure Parkinson's or Alzheimer's would create a market for lots of fetal tissue, since a lot of fetal tissue would be necessary to cure the Alzheimer's and the Parkinson's. And therefore, this should be avoided. But it is true that abortions, in order to generate fetal tissue, are absolutely illegal, and no one has suggested otherwise. So I gather, tell me if I'm wrong, that you would rather have people suffer from curable diseases. You would rather have people, you think it's more moral to have people suffer from Alzheimer's, who could be cured, suffer from Parkinson's, who could be cured, rather than use fetal tissue from abortions that would occur anyway, tissue that would otherwise be discarded. You would make the moral choice and you would impose it on society that those people should suffer from the diseases if they were curable. Am I correct?
The ends never justifies the means. You
Okay,
can't
so the
extinguish
answer is
one
yes.
life to save another.
So the answer is yes, you would, because the ends don't justify the means. And the ends here, which is to cure people's diseases, don't justify the moral wrong of using tissue from an abortion that was not performed for this purpose, but tissue that would otherwise be thrown out. And you would rather have people suffer from the disease. Okay, we have a disagreement, and it's a very clear moral disagreement. And I hope you will not try to impose your moral view on the rest of us. Third, everyone, I shouldn't say everyone, there's been a number of questions asked about the consent form to donate tissues. Are any of you in clinic settings where such consents might be sought? Dr. Lee, Dr. Shamanda, Dr.
Yes.
Goldstein?
Yes.
You are.
Which kind of consents are you talking about? You mean for fetal tissue?
Yes.
Fetal tissue from aborted,
Yes,
from
the
abortion?
fetal
No,
tissue
no.
from a specific abortion to be used for research or whatever.
No, consents
You're
for
not?
research.
Okay.
For human research.
So you're not there, you don't really see what's going on. It's sort of a red herring, because what I think some of the members of this panel are really concerned about is that the underlying abortion decision, not the separate donation decision. I think you're concerned about that because you said abortion is always morally wrong, and the mother should be, any mother who's so morally depraved as to consent to an abortion should be deprived of the right to consent to
The basis for that, my argument was not that she was deprived because she was making a depraved decision.
Sure it was.
But because she was, no, that was not my argument. My argument was that she lacks the authority to make the decision because the authority to make a decision for your child is based on your having the interest of that child at heart.
Because of your
Someone
moral
who
decision-
chooses to
because
have
of
her
your-
aborted is no longer has
reclaiming
that
my time, which is going to run out.
Sorry.
Because of your moral decision, you would take that right away from her for the reasons you or I stated in different form. And yet at Planned Parenthood, coming back to my question, we know that at Planned Parenthood, only after providing consent for abortion is the patient given the option for tissue donation. Tissue procurement personnel are trained to obtain informed consent for tissue donation only after the patient has consented to the abortion procedure. There is no evidence whatsoever, and is anybody aware of any evidence, that any donors of fetal tissue have ever felt coerced? That's my last question. Is anyone aware of any such?
I would say that the general knowledge and the general knowledge that these things are used in for these could tilt the scale in favor of the
But
decision.
you're aware of no coercion or?
Gentleman's time is expired.
Thank you.
Mr. Duffy, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to ask to have put Exhibit A1, 2, and 3 put up. And I want to go to Exhibit A2 for the panel. And maybe before I get there, Dr. Goldstein, you have to imagine what a aborted baby looks like when it comes out. Do you know how long it takes to carve out a little baby heart or a little baby lung or a little baby lung, or to take a little baby head? Do you know how long it takes?
I have no knowledge of that.
You're a doctor, though, correct?
I'm a PhD.
PhD. Okay.
Sorry.
Any
I'm a scientist, not a physician.
Any idea? Well, to the panel, do you guys, anyone know how long that would take? No. From those I've asked, it doesn't take very long. Happens pretty quickly. And so on the moral ethical conversation, usually as we look at economies, the more you produce, the cheaper something becomes. You become more proficient at it. But if you look at the pay scale, and by the way, let's be clear what this is. We have the procurement business that sends in a technician, one of their employees, into the abortion facility, embedded in the facility, that is looking at women who are coming through the facility and going out and getting consent to harvest these little baby lungs, little baby hearts, little baby heads. Does it seem odd to you that the cost of procurement, when you go from 10 to 11, the cost doesn't get cheaper, the cost or the payment gets more for the technician. The technician gets more money the more that they produce. Does that seem odd to you if profit motive is not an element of this business? Dr. Goldstein, does that seem strange?
I have no basis on which to judge that. I can barely see the exhibit.
Well, I think it's in front of you. Open up your little packet. I think it's right there.
Nope.
I'm asking you to use your common sense. You don't have to be a PhD.
Honestly, I'm not going to speculate about something that I don't have firsthand knowledge of.
Well, let's talk about firsthand knowledge, because you're obviously in the business and promoting the use of fetal tissue. And I think you earlier indicated that you would agree with the law that we shouldn't make a profit. Profit shouldn't be made off the sale of little baby body parts, right? Is that your testimony?
So that has its roots, as I understand it, in the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act.
Do you agree with it? Do you agree with the fact that we shouldn't profit off of the sale of baby body parts?
Yes.
Okay. And so what work have you done to make sure, I think it was Neural Stem, doesn't make a profit off of the baby body parts that they receive from clinics, or they don't pay clinics for the body parts that they receive? Do you do any research into that?
I have asked them if they complied with the law. They have told me they complied with the law.
So that's it?
Just as you trust the man sitting next to you to comply with the law,
I don't trust Mr. Harris.
then
But that's all you've done, though. You haven't taken any further steps.
I'm in no position to actually launch an inquiry like that. I don't have investigative powers the way the Congress does.
So you'd agree that the Congress should use its investigative powers to look into this issue?
No, I don't. I honestly think that Congress has better things to do with its time.
Yeah. And we should just take on blind faith because, well, you get a specimen. How much do you pay for a specimen? A line. What do you pay for it?
The material we get from Neural STEM is provided under a collaboration.
How much do you pay?
We don't pay them anything for it.
They give it to you for free.
It's part of the whole cost of doing the clinical trial. So we pick up part of the cost of the clinical trial and doing the surgery. They pick up part of the cost. They provide the cells.
So there's no financial incentive. They're just a pure middleman. They don't make any money on this. Is that your position, Dr. Goldstein?
I would be surprised if they didn't have a financial incentive. They're a publicly held company. They're required by law to have a profit motive.
So
I don't know the details of how they carve out where they generate
You just
profit
told me
and where they don't.
that you agree with the law that they shouldn't make a profit, but then you assume that they aren't making a profit.
They're growing cell lines which are derived from fetal origin. It is not the fetal tissue itself. The NIH recognizes a distinction between established cell lines and fetal tissue itself.
We have an incentive to procure more specimens and get more money for those specimens. I think that calls into question a need to look a little deeper. Quickly, do you think, Dr. Goldstein, that we should be using this research, as Ms. Charo would say, for taste tests in cosmetics?
I think the issue of cosmetics was adequately addressed by Representative Spear, I believe it was, a few moments ago, where treatment for burns is an adequate and appropriate cosmetic reason.
Don't you then think that in the sheet where people we're going to get consent that we should say this is not life-saving, this is for taste tests, or this is for cosmetics?
Time has expired.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I will reclaim my 5 minutes and wrap this up. You all have been patient with us as we look at the bioethics of this situation. Dr. Shamanda, what I have seen is a difference of opinion between some of those on whether fetal tissue is necessary, it's a convenience, or it's a cost savings. So can you kind of help us understand how that difference of opinion exists?
Absolutely. I think the issue of researchers using fetal tissue is largely over-exaggerated. There's $76 million from the NIH given to those that use fetal body parts for their research. That's out of an annual budget of $30 billion. That amounts to 0.25%. Also, there's maybe 160 investigators funded by the NIH. There's 300,000 investigators overall funded by the NIH. So this is not going to change the direction of science. Just 2 days ago, I looked at PubMed, which is the area you look for the most recent scientific or all the scientific publications. There's over 32,000 articles on adult stem cell therapy, and rarely ever do you get to publish anything with a negative result. I think that science will probably be better without it, because whenever we do have limitations, or on both sides of the panel, we say, when you have a problem, you typically, I completely agree in the creativity of the scientific mind to overcome these challenges, and I think I know we will come up with
Let me
results.
ask you one more thing. There's been a question about the immunized mice. Can't that come from adult stem cells?
You know, I can't speak to specific things, but what I know from colleagues of mine doing immunology research is they say it is not essential. It has given them nothing more than what they already get from adult stem cell models.
All right, I want to go back to, and I'm going to come to you, Dr. Lee. Go back to Exhibit 3, but let's go a little bit further down this permission form. Do you have the permission form in front of you, I think?
I don't.
Okay. If someone will be sure that these are at the desk, or Ms. Shamanda, if you have one, if you will share. Okay. As you look at Exhibit 3, and we've talked about the statement at the top of that permission form that is misleading, go a little further down. It says, I understand I have no control over who will get the donated blood and or the tissue or what it can be used for. And then a little further down, I understand there will be no changes to how or when my abortion is done in order to get my blood or the tissue. And the next one, I understand I will not be paid. Now, as we look at this, I would like to hear from you, Dr. Lee, because we've heard about how quickly the tissue has to be pulled. Dr. Shamanda talked about this, of how they have someone so close at hand within those first few minutes, and then the tissue is properly treated and moved on for the research that they are going to go. Do you think this is a proper representation to women who are going in for an abortion, who don't understand that there is a profit motive or a financial motive behind this when you look at Form A2 that shows what they're being paid, and then they're asked to say and agree that they have no control over their donated blood or tissue, and that there will be no changes or manipulations on that abortion or how it is done and the time that it is done, and that there is no financial compensation to them. I'd like to hear your take on the ethics of the situation with these items on that form.
Well, it seems to me that there's an effort to present this in what I would say a sanitized manner. It sounds like everything is being done altruistically, and that no one here is making any money off of this. And I think when you talk about someone who is there in working on site, who gets compensated more, the more parts are received, it makes it a little less makes it incredible to think that no one is really profiting from these things or is getting paid. So, and I think I think that raises questions about the accuracy of the representation about this all being that there's no profit motive involved, that there's no that it's always just completely altruistic. Also, I think it's good to note that all of this is at a time when it gets presented to them when I think knowing that this is something that might come up that is done, that fetal tissue is so-called donated, that can tilt the scale, I think, in her decision. So I just don't think it's I don't think it's credible to say that
my time has expired, and I would ask you to wrap up. I thank you for the answer to the question. I would like to remind all members that they have 10 business days to submit questions for the record, and I ask the witnesses to respond to the questions very promptly. I know we are all going to have questions for writing. Members should submit those questions by the close of business on March 16th.
Madam Chair, I move to enter into the record 10 articles regarding non-fetal sources to treat some of the neural and renal diseases we discussed here today. The minority's been provided with copies.
Without objection, so moved.
Madam Chair, I'd like to have submitted to the record the documents that that have already been approved by the majority.
Absolutely, so ordered. We thank our witnesses. And yes, we are going to submit for the record the exhibits that we have used today. Without objection, so ordered. And without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned.